and the process from start to finish and hopefully make something cool. So let's get going with some supplies. Also, we will have a break for questions if you guys have questions, but feel free to send your questions while I'm painting if they are relevant to the information I'm working on. I will try my best to answer them at the moment. So let's go and talk about some supplies. To start, I'm painting with a pochade box. This is from Alla Prima Pochade. This guy Ben Haggett makes them. They're really great. They're loaded with springs, and things are much easier than the old French easels to use. You can look him up on the internet. Great guy. Has a wet panel carrier, and like this thing with the springs is really handy. You can kind of use less hands with tightening and loosening equipment. Next thing is the panel I'm going to be painting on. I'm painting on these ampersand gesso boards. This one's a 9x12 for today. I really like how they are, the texture of the surface. They paint really nicely if you're using the right brushes, and we'll go over that. And I do trust their sort of archival quality. For brushes, I will be using nylon brushes. I mainly paint with nylons, the synthetic from Trekell when I'm painting on the smooth panels. If I paint on a canvas, I'll use a bristle brush like these. Same shapes. I like the filberts a lot. I use the rounds for the small ones, and I'll explain why. But I like a lot of these for on a canvas. Having the heavy brush texture complements the surface of the canvas and the way they kind of lay down paint. When I'm painting on these smoother panels, it is the bristles tend to take the paint off a little bit, so I'll use the smoother or the softer brush, which will actually lay down the paint nicely. I really love synthetics. I've just kind of trained on them, and I use them for acrylics, oils, watercolors, gouache, everything, and they work well for me. I don't have much experience with the natural hairs, so I don't have anything to really compare them to. I like the filbert shape because to me, I'll be able to get more calligraphic brush strokes. I can use the edge for sharp lines. I can use the flat of it for nice wide marks, and I can even paint with it using the length of it for width and that size brush stroke. So there's a lot of versatility in a filbert shape. When I get down to the smaller brushes, I find that the filberts they actually remove the paint a little more, so I like the rounds because when they lay flat, they kind of have that filbert shape, and so they hold the paint. I can do those marks I like to make. I never really use flats, and it's just a preference thing. I think flats are great for buildings and stuff, but for me, they don't really work for what I do. Next, we can talk about so the palette here is just built into the box. It's wood. I like wood. It's sealed with whatever he used, some sort of wood finish. That's been great. It's never been a problem. It's never been absorbent. I stain this thing to kind of match how I'm painting, and that helps me just have a general tone underneath. Glass is great too, but I just don't use glass too much because I travel with this a lot. Let's go over the colors now. Or actually, I have a palette knife too. I don't really paint with palette knives. I like them for certain things. I just use standard palette knives. I like this kind of spade shape the most. But I mainly use it for cleaning up. So we'll go into colors now from left to the right. This is the Cad Green Pale. I'm using mainly a lot of the colors for consistency is Winsor Newton. I don't love their products, but I do like the colors, and I'm used to them because I trained on those in school. So this is the Cad Green Pale. Some brands might just have a Cad Green that looks similar. This is Winsor Newton's Burnt Sienna, but it's also just, I think their pigment is the transparent oxide orange, or that PR101 synthetic iron oxide. So just pay attention to that because it does look different than Burnt Sienna. The next one's Scarlet Lake, which is like a cadmium red light. I just trained on that in school, so I got used to it. Yellow Ochre Pale from Winsor Newton. Some brands, their regular yellow ochre looks like that. Winsor Newton has a pale, a light, a regular. I think that's too many yellow ochres. This is Indian Yellow, also from Winsor Newton, a color I don't always use, but it's great for kind of the lack of yellow on the palette. When you mix it with white, I can show you what happens with that. This is Radiant White from Gamblin. I like titanium, I like the opacity of it, but I found that their regular titanium, because of the linseed oil, yellowed a lot more than their Radiant White, which has safflower oil in it, and it seems to be working okay. I've seen some charts online where people Had the white sitting for 10 years and that one's still yellowed, but I personally haven't had it, and I've kind of been monitoring a few little swatches of it. This is manganese blue hue. All the brands look kind of similar, very close to like a cerulean or a cool blue. Next is cobalt blue. Again, the brands seem to be pretty similar in color. This really dark one here is dioxazine purple. Not always used, but a nice handy violet color. Next to that is my alizarin crimson substitute. I like alizarin crimson as a color. I don't trust it for light fastness. I've seen some pretty good examples of it fading within 10 years. So I switched to Old Holland's alizarin crimson Lake Extra because to me that was the best for its transparency, its temperature, its darkness, and everything kind of. It was the best substitute I've found for alizarin crimson, but it's one of the expensive pigments. So if you're just practicing, alizarin's beautiful. The next one here is olive green. It looks really dark. I use it to make black. Winsor Newton makes theirs very dark. It's basically I think it's like an ivory black pigment with something similar to the Indian yellow when you read the ingredients. So making black out of this is easy because it's that dark already. Some brands, I think, Gamblin's is way too light. It looks like an olive, a green olive, not a black olive. And I think Old Holland has a dark one, and Rembrandt carries a pretty dark one. And also the M. Graham, theirs is pretty dark too. So more important is the color than the name or the brand to me in this case. And then the final blue here is ultramarine blue. The reason I've added this blue to the end is that I've been painting with this green to this green since 1998. This was a late addition after trying different combinations for black, and I kept the ultramarine blue and ditched the burnt umber. Down here, sometimes I'll put maybe burnt umber if I need it, raw umber, black, just extra colors. So that's what that kind of weird pile is. I'm not going to use any mediums today. I'm just using Gamsol. I like solvents only, again, just how I trained. I don't think it's better. In some ways, it's probably worse to not put some medium in there, but that's just what I'm used to. And then regular paper towels. I always have paper towels in hand. I think that's one of the most important things that I see people doing in my classes that drives me a little bit nuts, is not having a paper towel ready or something ready to clean up your mess, because with oil paint we make lots of messes and it's oily and it gets everywhere. So I think it's important to have a little bit of control. Today I'm going to be painting mostly on the palette. To me, the painting is happening on the palette. The drawing is on the canvas. So we can get started. I'll be explaining everything as I go, even if I make mistakes. But pay attention to me. Palette is the most important thing, I think, out of this. A very organized system. I'm going to mix a big shadow pile, a big light pile, probably a background. Today, my model is my good buddy John Paul. Painted him many times, so hopefully we won't screw this one up for you. Alright, so let's get started with painting. I start every painting with olive green, alizarin crimson, and ultramarine blue. What I learned from this palette was to paint with ultramarine, or with the olive green and the alizarin crimson, and make black. Essentially a dark orange and a dark green that kind of neutralize each other because of their place on the color wheel. They're both somewhat warm, so you get a warm black. I like this color, but I found like it lacks the range of going extra cold. So one thing I do is I mix, I'd say probably 10 to 20% red with 80% green. Sometimes when I'm doing demos, I overshoot the green just to make the point, but today I'll try not to. I mix the paint very dense at the top here, knowing that I'm going to thin some of it for my wash. I'll put the blue in. Once I balance the red and green, then I put the blue, and now I have more control of black. So I have 3 colors to make my black. I have a lot of range with what temperature that can end up. Now what I'll do is I'll dip my brush in solvent, and down at the bottom I'll start thinning it. That way I don't dilute the pile, but I can kind of see how I can use really thin paint if I want, and make it thicker when I need. So lots of solvent right now just to kind of get it off the brush. What I'm going to do is get rid of the white of the canvas, or in this case panel. So when I'm toning a board, I take a lot of things into consideration. I'm going to paint dark to light, so the lighter side of the flesh is going to be the last thing that's painted. So I may tone most often with the lighter tones in mind, but also I tested on the edges because I don't want to just put a bunch of paint right into the middle of the canvas. I feel like it's a little green, which might be okay. Every once in a while, I think it's nice to do a complementary color as a tone, but also if you want to make it easier, just do something similar to what the target is. I'm going to paint, knowing I'm going dark to light, I'm going to get his hair and darkness out of the way quickly, and the background too. So I could also take a little red right now, and maybe in part of it just start putting some more reds in where the background's going to be, because that will start to give me a correct temperature. So I've seen people do like burnt sienna type of grounds where you end up with the cooler tones on top, and then it contrasts nicely when they show through, or vice versa. A very cold ground with the warm skin tones on top looks great too. The other option is just make it easier on yourself and tone it with kind of safe medium colors. So that's what I'm going to do. And I think for the sake of demonstration, the safe bet is always the better choice. So I'm going for something that's about the value of the lighter side, not necessarily the highlights, but maybe more average. At first it's going to look kind of dark because we saw white for so long, and then when you're putting down those dark colors, your eyes have to adjust to that. But you'll see once I start getting all my darks in, how that will actually change. So that to me is a fine average for the light values, and now I'll just start drawing into that. If it's too wet, I might wipe it with a towel. If it's too dark, same thing. It's sort of, nothing can get really too ruined at this point. I think in any case, if you're gonna get it wrong, make it too light, not too dark. Because that way you can still see your drawing. The whole point going dark to light is to see the drawing the whole time. So now what I'm going to do is grab a smaller brush. I'm using a number 5 round. This thing will give me the versatility to do the tiniest little dots, but also make a brush stroke that's pretty wide like that. So it has a lot of range. I'll just keep making sure I grab more paint so I can draw now. We have a lot of darkness with his hair and beard, so I'll need a lot of this paint, but I can kind of mix as I go. I'm mixing my black up here because I'm starting to organize my palette. From here over is going to be the shadows. I'll put the background down here too to just get it out of the way, and next to the shadows, since it will influence the shadows. So now I'm just going to draw. I don't want it quite as thick as pure paint, but I don't want it as thin as that wash. So now I'm just finding that middle till it feels right, and I use the paper towel in hand to just make sure also. As far as composition is going to go in this, we're just putting a head on a canvas. There's not really a lot of options. You could be like super artsy and put the head down here, but that's not what this is about today. So we will just start. I like to kind of make a mark at the top just to make sure I don't like start drawing and the head grows off the canvas. I don't want to go too low also because I just find it feels a little bit awkward. So I'll use his hair shape in this case and just start to place his head in the page. Sometimes I like to put in shoulders. It just really depends. And this shape is very general to me. It's enough to see where I'm headed, but I'm not committed to it. Okay, so now what I do, instead of I don't love to draw the whole head and then try and fit the features on, because I find no matter what, I get it wrong. So if I can kind of get some general shapes to make sure the head doesn't leave the page, then I'll start moving into the center a little more, or working from the top down. So in this case, I can start to draw his hair, forehead, all that, kind of the height and width of everything. And then from there, I can start making decisions about the next move based on the previous one. So let's say, no matter what his forehead is, wherever I draw it, whatever height width I choose, I can kind of go off of that and measure things. And you can physically measure with your brush by finding proportional size relationships, or using plumb lines or angles. I like to kind of wing it a little bit and paint more gesturally and hope that I get it right. And then if I do, great, then it has a little bit of freshness. If I get a little stuck, I can always measure. With measuring, I just think make up stuff, whatever it is that you need to see. So I'm going to just start looking at his eye socket area, which is sort of, the brow goes above the socket, but I'm still going to be looking at those as shapes. I'm also thinking about things purely as shape, tone. Not worried about is that there's an eye in there right now. Like that's one of the biggest things I notice with students is like, I don't know how to draw eyes. Well, you don't really need to know how to draw eyes. You need to know how to draw a ball, and I think most people can do that. It's once we have it in our minds that it's an eye that things get a little bit, I feel like a little bit scary. So don't draw an eye. Draw everything around the eye, and then the eye should show up. Should. So I'm looking at his eyebrows, and as I'm drawing right now too, in my mind, I'm imagining he's looking to my left, so the center line isn't in the center, it's always over here. I have this imaginary thing happening. I actually think this could be a little scooted over, so just scratch it to make visual note for myself. But I'm always aware of the head being slightly turned to my left, and the light is on my right. So all the shadows are dropping down on the left side of every form, or on the bottom also, because we have the light coming from up top. When I'm drawing eyes right now too, even though I'm not drawing eyes, I'm drawing around the eyes like I said. I am looking at them, sort of their relationship to each other as far as shapes go, so that I don't put one eye down here and one eye up here accidentally. I also prefer to kind of draw them at the same time, one then the other. So it's just shapes, remember, like how can I flatten it out? We're really like naturally drawn to detail, I think, and so like it's hard to sometimes see a person as just a bunch of shapes and patterns, and we kind of want to make everything, especially eyes, so precious. What I did there was I just grabbed a little bit more alizarin. I have the option now, I have 3 colors coming into this mix that are making it, and so I'll adjust a little bit as I go and put temperature down. Like maybe we got more alizarin around the eyes. That's the stuff under the skin that I feel like gives you the life, that reveals the blood. And I say this a lot in workshops and it sounds gross, but the truth is, like, behind all that skin is a bunch of meat and blood and stuff, and like, so let's put those warm colors in there and like give us that life. If we drain the blood, we don't have those reds, they go away. So sometimes you gotta be gross to make a point. So now also I'm drawing his eyebrows. I can grab a little more blue, so it's just slightly cooler. Letting the brush do a lot of the description of hair at this point, because the brush is made of hair. So instead of drawing individual hairs, add a little bit of solvent. The paint leaves a little bit of streaking, and that gives me a little more feeling of hair. Okay, so now that I kind of feel comfortable there, I can start to bring the shapes in if I want, just to make sure the proportions to the top are even, make sure this is okay. Sort of working center out. When I was in school, first semester, I took this class and the teacher had us paint, or we were drawing, so we weren't painting. Teacher didn't have us paint, we were just drawing. We were doing, everybody sat facing, 4 people sat facing each other's profiles, and everybody was told to just draw from the ear very carefully, no lay-ins, draw on the whole ear, measure everything off the ear, and just kind of find height and width and relationship and size, and everybody's drawings were the best they had done for likeness up until that point. And so it was really revealing to me of how that kind of style of drawing, instead of kind of big general shapes of ovals and plumb lines and everything, just kind of being careful working shape to shape. If your subject's sitting very still, you can be pretty accurate, purely based on measuring. Everything can be measured in drawing. Okay, so now I'm looking at this shadow. I really want to make sure I get this height correct, because to me that's one of the things that like I know is one of my weaknesses. A lot of times when I'm painting from life, I'll have the model sitting up on a pretty high stand, and I'll sit very close, so we're looking up their nose, which makes everybody look really epic, but it throws off proportions. So it's always good to kind of know some of your weaknesses so you can address them. If you know you have something that you do every time, slow down in that moment, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do right now. I put a little more red there. As I'm drawing this, I'm not looking at lights, I'm just looking at this sort of space between here and that next shadow. And his shadow, on his nose, I'm grouping the shadow plane with the cast shadow. These are just place holding colors for me too. This is just the drawing. I'm not yet putting down any color that's going to stay. So that's starting to feel okay. I see, now I'm looking here. What do I have here? Not a ton. I got a beard, so we can work with that, but let me just make sure I like where this is. And the thing is, I'm gonna get it as close as I can at this stage. That way I can focus on the other things. But no matter what, we're gonna be drawing the whole time. Things are gonna shift. I'm gonna see things differently. I might see something that looks more interesting. So I'm really trying to like just get that part of his face in shadow. And then now, pretty soon, well, I gotta draw his mouth, but we have so much hair and facial hair to work with that I'm gonna use a lot of that to find some of the rest of this drawing. So let's switch to, well, I'll use this brush just for now because I'm gonna do the beard. We'll go cooler, start getting some of that temperature in, so grab the blue and just make a little corner of it bluer. Grabbing the solvent, that way I can get those little streaks. I'd rather go thin at first and build it up as I go. So let's just start to, that's too wet, so wipe the brush off, grab the paint again, and then I put a quick wipe on the towel just so that I don't deposit too much paint where I don't want it. So what I'm gonna do is, with hair and stuff, I like to go really sort of diluted on the first pass and make a tone that looks slightly lighter than the black that of the colors I'm using, and then I'll take the thicker paint, pure black, and then make the darker tones. So a few things, like at this stage I'm just thinking about shadows and lights. Not thinking about tones within shadows, I'm not thinking about tones within lights, I'm separating shadows from light. I really like to kind of imagine it like a stencil, like Banksy or something, where it's like a black and white image, and all we're doing is separating the two ideas, something that's in that spotlight that's up there and stuff that's not in that spotlight. So we'll sneak the mouth in there. I can do that while I'm there. Put a little bit of red in another part of this black mix, because mouths tend to be more red. Remember what's in there. Don't need to say it again. So a little bit of red. Again, if you open your mouth, it's red inside. So just a little accent of that. Dip the brush so I don't put the red in the beard. Now back to this other mix. I can grab blue. Even the green works well for hair because it's relatively colder than the reds that I just did. Okay, so let's go down to the below the lip, because I'm sort of working my way down his face. That hair is a little bit lighter, so maybe I can make sure that I let the paint just kind of almost apply it and wipe it off at the same time. It's a little tricky, but that's the beauty of the paper towel and the solvent. The way I'm holding my brush, I don't really think about. I've had people in videos point out I hold the brush wrong, so now I'm going to be self-conscious for the duration of this video about how I hold my brush. Please comment on that. I want to know what I'm doing. The guy who said I hold my brush wrong never elaborated, so never got an answer. So here we got more hair, so let's just let the brush kind of describe the hair. Let it streak, the direction of growth, the sort of big masses behind the hair. Where it's a little bit lighter, then I either add more pressure or I will just make the paint wetter. I'm gonna grab a bigger brush now and work on the larger mass of hair real quick. Again, thin the paint so that we can kind of start to describe the direction, and it's a little more brown in there, which is okay. I can always add cooler highlights back to it later, but the goal here is to try and get as much done without sort of planning ahead to highlights in hair, because I like the way this transparent stuff looks a little more for hair. It's kind of what I was taught, but also what after trying all kinds of things, it's sort of, I go back to this transparency. For the highlighting in hair, instead of like trying to go too opaque. And again, all this, as this painting goes, will change. I'll be able to adjust things. It's still just kind of a general sketch. So again, I'm not going all the way dark yet. I'll get that next. I'm just going to put these tones, which will be the feeling of the lighter tones once I get in the darker tones. I break everything down, I would say, into the most simple values first, which is 2. Light stuff, not light stuff. And then now I'm doing that even with the hair. So the hair is its own separate thing. It'll have the lighter versions and then the darker versions. I probably put too much solvent to get too dark just yet in there, so we'll see how that goes. But the goal would be now to give that hair a little bit more volume. Not that your hair, John Paul, doesn't have volume. It looks great today.
Thank you.
Yes. What kind of conditioner are you using? Okay, so now let's give that some more volume. I see a dark shadow kind of area here. So this is it, where if it's not going down, it's a little too wet, and as this painting starts to set up a little bit, the solvent leaves and goes into our lungs, we can, I can lay the paint down a little more cleanly. So no big deal if I don't get it all done right now. I'm just trying to get in those darkest darks. Getting in the darkest darks early is pretty important for me because I can judge everything off of that. The lightest light, I don't know what it is. It's not white, but the darkest dark will definitely be really, really dark. As dark as I can possibly go, so that's the goal right now. Go as dark as I can possibly go at this stage and get some mass in the hair. So I see shadows, kind of thinking of the hair as round forms, trying to give volume. I see the dark here, light there. I won't touch that light just yet. I'll maybe put in a highlight, maybe I'll scratch through the paint, we'll find out. Maybe down here I'm looking for dark to give that a little more volume. I know over here we've got the dark wall, so one thing too is like don't be seduced by highlights and dark hair. I've noticed a lot of people doing like highlights and dark hair and then they end up looking like they have white hair. If you've done that, you've gone too light. So now let me just sketch the rest. I didn't put in, this will all be shadow. I don't really need to tone the shadow area in right here for me to actually see the drawing enough. I can see it pretty well, so I did the tone and around the features because it's a lot easier for me to find things, but at this stage now I will not worry so much. And then right after I say that, I'm going to tone in the shadow anyway. It happens every time. So just disregard what I said. Let's just get that sort of covered with something. Okay, so shirt is a dark shape. Let's just treat that like the hair for now. It's black. It's not totally black. It looks like I needed some violet, so I put blue and red. Again, just sticking to those few colors for now. And down here, I like stuff to be kind of more fun and painterly. I'm not trying to paint all the way to the edges too carefully. I did have an instructor in school say, don't paint the edges because it lets the viewer kind of be more forgiving on you being painterly or something, which stuck, I guess. It's true in some way. I've noticed where like I had a really freshly painted head and then I painted the edges all the way out. And once I painted the edges all the way out, all of a sudden it looked unfinished rather than fresh. I don't know exactly why, but he was right. Okay, so that's fine now for, I'd say, some drawing. The gray shirt, I could probably try and go real thin with the blue. I do think it's nice to get as much as you can out of this first stage, but some stuff needs to be saved for actual color mixing and opacity. So maybe I just put a little bit more blue as a wash here, and that can start to be, yeah, I don't like that. See, I should have listened to that instructor's advice. Now we'll have to fix that. Loose, David Loose. Okay, so after that mistake, moving on. Something to me just looks awkward and I'll deal with it. Don't look at it though. Next step will be, let's just put the background in. Even though I said I go dark to light, no matter what, if it's a light background, I'll put it in early because it's the environment. The environment, a very small space of environment in this case, will actually affect the shadow color, so I'll put it in. But no matter what, I put it in because it's framing the face. I'm going to use this brush that I already used because I don't want to clean two brushes when I can clean just one. It's a reddish background. It's some sort of crushed velveteen. I have darks and lights. I don't care that much about making it specific. I care more about just framing his face. Over here there's a little bit of shadow. I can kind of see if I lean over. So maybe I'll use that as my guide for mixing the darkest. I'll mix it darker first and then get lighter as I go. I got a lot of solvent and paint down there, so I just give it a quick little wipe. Being red, my first two choices are red and red. I do get that a lot, questions about how to make red, and I think all you do is just use red. Use the reds you have. Sometimes people get too wrapped up in like this being magic, and it's not. So I use the two reds, it's too orange, so luckily I have purple. Let's try purple. And that's going to darken it a little bit, which is great. Dioxazine, purple. A very, very strong color. It can ruin your whole day if you're not careful, and ruin your whole palette. I did have a cat once in college get into it and drag it all over the apartment. I ended up having to paint my carpet with oil paint just to hide it. Little tip for you. It works terribly. But you know what? Just run. Okay, so let's put a little bit of dark behind. I can start to see how that relationship's going to sit. And I don't mind even having the background leaning towards the dark side because I do want him to pop out. That's the ultimate goal. If I have the background competing, then I'm just making more work for myself. I'm putting a touch of white in it now because I want to lighten it. I do need to decide if that, once I put white, it's going to change the temperature. And it makes it cooler. White always seems to cool things, which is okay. I don't mind that. One of the tricks, I think, and just kind of out of practice knowing, if I make that thinner, so I've made it cooler now in the mix, if I dilute it with solvent, which would be nice because I can get the background to sit flat and I can make it more streaky. I can, the way that paint lays down sort of with the pressure and I get that transparency gives me a little bit of that shimmer, and it doesn't look quite as cool as it did on the palette. And again, I don't care that much about the background. It's just a, not in this case anyway, it's just a color that's up there to be a color. So I'm looking at edges. Not too much going on with the edges. There's a little bit of separation. There's not like a ton of contrast or anything like that, so I won't get too worked up about that. Again, just make sure it's supporting the good stuff, which is the center of the painting. So now I'm pushing down into my original drawing, which I tend to try, if I can, if I get it right, is paint everything slightly larger than I want it, so that as I paint the next color into it, I can control the edge a little bit. I'm not a big like edge person. I don't really care too much about all the different types of edges. I think I like some hard edges too. I studied illustration, so this is sort of based on that kind of education where it's always just about sort of making the image. I didn't learn a lot about like paint, traditional techniques or mediums or anything or glazing. It was always very direct painting, always from life, at least for portraits and stuff like that. And long poses for us in school were 5 hours, the longest we got. I'm using the edge of the brush. I just wipe the paint off, same colors on it, so it's not like a big drastic thing if I get it wrong, but I just wanted to remove some paint now that I'm looking at how his hair sits with the background. I want some separation here, so let's grab that paint, that heavier paint, make sure I put my darkest dark. When I say darkest dark, I mean black. I will use ivory black sometimes too, if no one's looking. But you're all looking today, so I'm going to mix black. But it's a really great addition actually to this. Like I get real beautiful transparent colors with this mix. I feel weird saying that I get beautiful colors. Beautiful colors come out of this mix. I don't know if you like them or not. Maybe you don't think they're beautiful. but with the ivory black, it just covers so much faster. And I think with these pigments, because of their transparency, beautiful, yet a little bit weak. And so like if I'm doing a really dark painting, I'll just grab the ivory black to get to the dark sooner, get to the blackest part of it sooner. And then balance. I'll mix a little bit into my mix and I get all the sort of variations, yet I can just cover it faster. But you can see how in this case the transparency is nice and gives the painting a little bit more life. So this area I had dealt with, I'm still unsure about whether I like it or not. I think part of the problem is that the sort of turn in his shoulder happens right around that spot. I maybe even need to like move this shirt over. That might be helpful. Good to figure it out now, but easy to do later as well. I think just for composition, everything's leaning that way. I think it'd be nice to kind of push this shirt over that way too, slightly. I don't know if that saved it, but it feels a little better. Okay. Now, on to some real painting with color. That to me is the drawing and the background. Step 1 and 2. Next thing now, we really start mixing colors. Again, going dark to light. Now we can see that like the tone I chose for the first wash is holding the place for the lights. So that's great, it worked out. I was studying illustration. We used to study all the classic American illustrators. And I was reading a Harvey Dunn book, and he was kind of talking, one of the things they would talk about is how the shadows will define the drawing, and the lights will define the color. Doesn't work in every case, but for illustration and stuff like that, it makes sense. Right now I have the shadows in, the shapes are there, they're defining my drawing. Without them, I don't have that drawing. Can you drop your chin just a touch? Yeah, perfect. So what I want to do now is put in more specific shadow colors, really start getting in a little bit of opacity. These would work, probably, but they might look more like holes than actual paint, and that's not the point of having you here in this video. What I'm gonna do, I don't know how much I'll use it, but I was taught to do this in school, is take this manganese blue and a little bit of white and make a tint of it. What we were using this for, and what I still use it for, is in a lot of classroom situations where I work, the students have to paint under fluorescent light or something kind of balanced, while the models might be sitting under something slightly warmer and stronger or something like that. So this will just sort of be, this was taught to me as sort of the fluorescent light in the room. So if you're painting with a warm spotlight on the model, the lights that everyone's sitting underneath will be a little bit warmer than that. So like these cooler tones would fill in shadow shapes and just give a little more atmosphere. The whole point, I could use blue and white and do that while I'm painting, or I could just make it, and this to me, now it's more like a light source. So when I need to add it, like say into his neck, maybe we get a little ambient light from the room shooting in, I just put the light source in. I have the shadow and I put the lights. So let's just make sure, I want to make sure I have enough darkest dark, so I'll mix a little more and just leave that up here. And now what I'm going to do into this area is mix my shadow average. You can call it mud, you can call it average, whatever you want to call it. A lot of people ask me about the mud. I don't really call it that, but that's what, when I was taught it, was described to me as. So what I do, if I have any one color to make shadows, it's not going to be blues, it's not going to be reds, it's going to be something neutral. And so this is a fast shortcut, this transparent oxide or burnt sienna in Winsor Newton's case. I put a lot out. I'm going to grab a little chunk of it, or maybe even a bigger chunk. I know I don't have a ton of shadows, so I don't need a ton of paint here. But what I'll do is I'll just start mixing it into this area. I'm not going to stop there. That's like, to me, kind of it's way too warm. In some cases that might be fine. I've mixed now, the black mixes in there, so that means there's 4 colors: alizarin, olive green, ultramarine blue, and the burnt sienna or transparent oxide. Too warm, so let's cool it. I can grab either blue. I'm going to grab the manganese only because I know that it kind of leans it towards green, almost like a raw umber in a way. And you could probably just use raw umber for this, but I don't have raw umber on there. And I do think this is much richer in sort of its transparency and all that stuff. Where to look? Darker shadows up here and in here, and then lighter shadows here. So the goal is to kind of go in between the two. It's sort of hard to like figure out where, and I think the easiest way to do that is maybe blur your eyes till they become like an average color, which is hard to do, or squint, or move your eyes around a lot so you don't like focus on one color, because if I focus on the neck, I'm going to allow more light into my eyes that's not there, and I'm going to see it as this lighter tone. Or if I look into the dark here too, the same thing's going to happen. So keep my eyes moving between the palette and the subject. I know I need to go lighter because it's way too close to black, so having the darkest darks in, really helpful. I can maybe compare the darker part of his neck shadow to his hair, because on the palette they're sitting next to each other. So let's just start putting in lighter stuff. I hear people coming in all the time saying, you can't put white in the shadows, or you're not supposed to put white in the shadows, and that's a fine place to start, but every single painting I've done probably has white in the shadow somewhere. So learn some rules, hear them, and then figure out how to break them. Because there's no real rules, it's just art. The whole thing with white and shadows is just make it work. You don't do too much white in the shadows. It shouldn't be the first thing you think about when you're doing shadows. Shadows are the darks. So and white's the furthest thing from making that happen. So instead, I'll use a color instead. Yellow's fine. Yellow ochre's working in this case. The cad green's great there too. Let's see, when you mix that with the Scarlet Lake, those two like kind of meet at orange. I treat that cad green like a yellow. So while that seems completely foreign to skin, it's a wonderful color for lightening shadows or cooling halftones or anything like that. So there, to me, I made that separate, but we can just mix it in. I like to treat this as just one average. So what happens now is, let's say I have background, and to me this is fine. I can look at this as color, I can see it next to black, I can see up there some of those shadows next to black and its relationship to the red background. On the palette I have the red. If I want a reflected light from red in his cheek, which might happen if there wasn't as much hair, take the red, put it in the shadow. Super simple. If I want to darken the shadow, take the shadow and darken it with your dark. Just take a little corner of it, don't go all the way to black. If I want a little bit like a fluorescent light bleeding in, take a corner of it and put a little fluorescent light bleeding in. It's a very kind of simple idea to start with a muddy average. Funny to call it mud, but that's the thing that keeps it unified. If it was a saturated color, it wouldn't, I mean, it would, maybe in the case of like colored lighting you would do that, but the idea with sort of basic white or yellowish kind of white light is that it will, it is essentially just that kind of muddy brown color that gets and then the little accents are saturated. So what I'll do now is go darkest, dark to light for me. But I'm mixed, so I can kind of jump around. I'm using that brush I mixed with. You might have noticed I mixed with a brush. A terrible habit. Don't copy me on that. But I just don't, I feel a little clumsy with a palette knife because I was taught to mix with a brush. It damages your brushes though. You get a lot of paint down in here into the ferrule, and that actually kind of screws them up. So what I'll do is sort of go, I can see, and I'm looking at the darkest shadows first because I want to go dark to light. I want to work out of that black. I like a little bit of transparency still at this stage. I mixed the paint more opaque, but I still want it slightly transparent. I do think that looks sort of best, and I think like a transparent shadow and a very opaque light, I think looks awesome. I mean, if you've ever seen a Rembrandt in person, he was a real stud with that stuff, and I'm not going to argue with him. Thick lights, thin shadows. I think part of it is the transparency in the paint and the thin shadow adds a little bit of luminosity, and then also just on the physical surface of the painting, the thin paint sits flatter, catches less glare, and if you get a glare on it, it's going to look too light. So I think that's also part of it. It's almost like creating, when you build up the lights too in sort of thicker passages, you're creating like a very subtle relief, almost like using the oil paint as a sculptural medium. I'm working around the eyes, trying to get those reds in. in the corners. Very subtle temperature, but enough. So that's, to me, that color seems fine. I was sort of testing it. Also, like when I mix the color, I'm spending a lot of time on the palette. My eyes are looking up there and looking down here, and I'm moving back and forth to make sure I'm feeling that relationship. And then I very carefully just put it down. I don't spend a lot of time on the actual painting, especially now that I have the drawing sort of out of the way. Out of the way in a way where I'm comfortable with it. I don't feel like I'm going to get too lost. Of course, like I said before, we are adjusting as we go. The other side looks, because the light's coming in from that side, I think that looks a little more reflective and a little warmer. So I grab that Scarlet Lake and go right to where I was mixing already, because I don't want them too different. I want the relationship between those two shapes to be the same. And if I want to bring out that transparency or bring out that warmth, a very little bit of solvent, and then sort of the way I apply the paint maybe will give us that. Like right there, you can see there's a little more transparency, and I like that. It looks nice. If it gets too transparent, it might look like a hole, but the right balance of kind of opaque mixes with transparent application through the solvent, extra solvent, really makes it work. I don't like to draw these details, but I feel like the little creases up there to me are kind of important right now for drawing and likeness, so I'm just going to put them in a little more dark. Okay, so I'm feeling okay with that. Eyebrow feels okay, no more shadows there. Down the nose, next shadow. Compare it to the last shadow. A little bit lighter, maybe, not much different. Let's make it not much different. I know where it is on the palette. Over here we can see a nostril, so I'll just kind of group that still with the shadow, but maybe darker, and make sure this thing comes in right. To me, I find this distance to be one of the hardest, because, and that's why I said in the beginning, like, that's my weakness, because there's less close landmarks maybe on that length of the nose. So I'll use like the sort of eye socket, any sort of shape I can see, the plane of skin that connects the bridge of the nose to the cheek, and just sort of use that to figure out where it goes. And again, it is kind of a guess. When I'm looking, a lot of the problem is when I'm looking at the models up, like I do in classes where I'm looking straight up their nose, is that the nose actually goes between the eyes, and that's just something like we aren't really used to seeing on a daily basis. That I painted too far over, but I think I'm going to scratch into it, because I just know, like, for me it's easier to see it. Like if you see something on the canvas that's wrong, and you know it's wrong, just address it, because it will really affect the way you decide on other things. Oftentimes when I'm working in a class or something, a student will come up and have an issue with a part of their painting, and by the time I'm done fixing it, I haven't touched the part that they thought was an issue. I touched everything else. So like, it's all relative. It might not be the thing you think. It might be. But if you know for sure something's wrong, get it out of there. Either soften it or something. So in here, we went a touch lighter. Not so much that it's jumping into any sort of light values, but I put a little yellow ochre in there. Probably would have worked to put that, and I have that mixed. I may use it. I mean, I should use it since I mixed it, so you can see how. But I also like sort of adjusting to my own mixes. If I over mix with red or something like I just did, I can use the cad green to bring it back to where I want it. But I could have easily used this and yellow. It was just a shorter move for me to grab the cad green. So most often I try and mix with the least amount of effort if I can. And I've been trying to do that a little more lately, because I was really taught to, I always felt like we had to put every color into the shadows or any color to make it usable. And I'm just starting to now try, because of teaching, like really make more simple mixes to see if we can just do it with two colors instead, or one color, and not make it too crazy. So. And it's just about efficiency too. I studied illustration, so we're always learning to like be faster. It was really about efficiency and speed, because as an illustrator you have quick deadlines, and also the quicker you paint, the more money you make. If you're sitting there wasting time on a job that you can get done a lot faster, you can make a lot more money. But deadlines are just very short in that illustration world too. Okay, so I put a little bit of dark and red around the mouth. I wanted that shadow to kind of start to, I was looking at the shadow on the chin, so I was just trying to like find that color, but then I realized I needed to do that other one first. So I got to get all this shadow in here. I'll put a little bit of cool because I went a little too warm. I'm pushing the hair out, and I think the hair is like, the value is so close right here that I don't know, like I'll probably darken the hair eventually, but at this point I won't, even though I just said fix it if you know you need to fix it, but I don't think that's really a problem. Here the hair goes, the neck turns all the way back into the hair, so I can just go with the darkest bit of that temperature range or value range by adding the black. And then now we can just put in a lighter shadow as the cylinder of his neck rolls around. Also just think of things as kind of simple shapes. Either the whole face can be made up of spheres and cylinders if you think of it that way. You know, actually right here I'm leaving this little bit of light, but I think I'll bring back a half tone in there. There's a little bit of a tone in there happening that I need to bring in. And now that part of the hair is bothering me, so let's just make sure I can clean up the drawing there.
Sure, we're going to have to take a break soon.
Yeah.
It's just gone 10 to. But
okay. Do we have any questions?
Not yet, but if you could just reiterate that they can submit questions.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. If anyone has questions while I'm working, I am totally open to answering them. Feel free to send them our way, and I will do my best to address them while working. Let me just put in this shadow and we can take a little break for that stuff too, I guess, huh?
That's fine.
All right, so last bit of shadow, which should be moving right along. A little more yellow. Let's just, for the sake of what we were talking about, put in some of that cool and see what happens. You see how it kind of just grays it out while lightening it. It kind of, like I was saying earlier, did something very similar to what just adding the blue with maybe some green, or I mean with some red. I mean with yellow. I'll get it right one of these times. So now let's connect those two. I know there's a big jump here. I can make it easier by just, on the palette here, I have them next to each other. Let's just kind of put in a darker tone. And now we have all our colors. We have unity because we came from this mass. We have variety because we mixed almost like little satellites out of it. And I mean, that's more or less shadows. So let's take a quick break. Okay, everybody in the internet world can get up and use the restroom. What do you want to do now? Now what do we do on break? Any questions? Send your questions.
No questions yet, but hopefully we get some submitted now.
Okay.
I'm waiting for some emails to come in.
I'd say just talk about a little bit about your education, a little more on the illustration. Where did you go? And
yeah.
where
Okay.
did you know?
So I grew up in San Francisco in a family of artists. My mom's side. My mom's from Hawaii, but her side is all from China, and so we had a lot of traditional kind of painters and drawers in my family. And when they'd move over from China to the United States, couldn't talk to them, so we'd draw, which was great. And I was just always into it as a kid. It wasn't something that I kind of sought out. It was just like what our family did, what I was into. My younger brother is a professional artist working on The Simpsons. Drawing backgrounds. My dad was a jeweler and he was doing a lot of art when I was a kid, so he has that kind of real technical side of craft and art making. And so I wanted to work on Star Wars. That was like my main thing, I think. As a kid, I loved Star Wars and I knew art through Star Wars a lot and stuff like that, and those Art of Star Wars books. And I had also, my cousin who went to Art Center, she was dating this guy Eric Tiemens, who was big time at at Lucasfilm and stuff, and I would hang out with him when I was a teenager, and we'd do some painting and stuff. And I never really back then I didn't really understand what he was doing, and I should have paid more attention. But I knew I wanted to do what he was doing for work. So I went to Art Center and moved to LA in 1998 from San Francisco to try and go to Art Center. I ended up getting in after applying and starting my education. When I got there, I met a couple of teachers who were doing more of the like illustrations, editorial illustrations, and they were so cool and really inspiring. And I had no sort of direction at that point anyway. I think all kids like realism, so that's all I had. It was like I liked realism, but then I saw these guys doing more kind of fun, illustrative stuff, and they were pushing us to think that way, and it was super fun and inspiring. And so I started shifting to wanting to do some of that, but then early on we have to take a lot of figure drawing and figure painting, and that's when I just really fell in love with oil painting and knew that's what I wanted to do. At some point I had decided maybe I would go back to illustration, but I've only done a few jobs in illustration since getting out of school. Towards the end of my education, I decided I wanted to be a teacher and show in galleries, because a lot of the teachers I had who were painting were teaching us the painting from life, they were showing in galleries, and I thought that's the coolest thing, to be able to paint what you want and make money that way. So that's the route I took. This school in Los Angeles was opening right when I graduated, so I got asked to teach there, and the same month I graduated from college, which was in 2002, I started teaching at this school. It was a real big shock for me, but now, however many, 16 years later, I'm still doing it and still showing in galleries and stuff. And through that first teaching gig, I got in my first gallery and started selling a lot of work, and I just kind of was in the right place at the right time with the right portfolio, I suppose. And since then, I've done a lot of fine art, a lot of gallery work, a lot of commissions, mainly that stuff. Teaching, I'm just finishing up teaching. I've been 10 years teaching at the college that I went to. Was full-time for the last 5 years, but I'm leaving that to go on my own finally. And going back to showing in galleries. I also tattoo on the side, play music, so got a lot of things going on, so I need to make more time. And that's where I'm at now.
What about some of your influences? Who are some of the artists that you love?
Influences. I mean, I think being in school, of course, all the same ones everybody loves who paints. Sargent, Zorn, Sorolla, all those greats. I mentioned Rembrandt. I love a lot of the older stuff. But also classic American illustration. Dean Cornwell, Harvey Dunn, Howard Pyle, N.C. Wyeth, all the Wyeths, you know, like that kind of stuff. I'm inspired by all kinds of things, so. Some questions?
We got some questions.
All right, I got some answers, I hope.
I hope so. We got from Paul Barker. He says, thanks for doing this. Can you share how your work has evolved over the last few years and where you see your work going in the next few years?
My work, personal work, has evolved. I've been really sort of into the Western scene and genre of painting. A lot of that happened when John Paul and my other friend moved up to the mountains and were spending a lot of time in the outdoors, kind of felt like the Wild West. But also having studied illustration like that, to me, was the start of it. And actually, if you look at the drawings I did as a kid, I was always into cowboys and stuff, and a lot of those, I used to have a Lone Ranger record I'd put on and get so excited when that song would come on. So it's like I have an opportunity to paint the stuff that I've always liked, and it's our sort of like some of our American history, and I think it'll be fun. I think also, having gone to Rome to teach a few years, I was looking at a lot of religious art and just seeing kind of those themes, those somewhat dark themes in churches, kind of gave me permission to maybe try those out too. So that's where I'm headed right now. Also, I'm doing I've been making blacksmithing and making knives for a few years, and I want to kind of incorporate that into my work a little more too. So my next solo show is going to have, which is in September, is going to have knives and paintings all kind of working together.
Awesome. Yeah, we're good. We can
Okay.
on to 11 o'clock.
All right, let's get back to painting. Send those questions. It's now or never. Okay, so every time we get back to painting, I sort of... Can you take the glasses off? I'll just paint them on.
Forgot about those.
I forgot I was going to change costumes every break too. I sort of reassessed what I was doing, checked back at least 1 or 2 stages, and just make sure that nothing stands out as crazy. Usually I like to get up and sort of look at the painting from a distance, but in this case I won't. I'm sort of used to that anyway with the way with teaching and stuff. So now we have like his hair is casting a little less of a shadow on that far cheek, which I like. No, let's just leave it because actually I like that, since that was an area I was sort of messing with. So what I'll do is I'll introduce some of this red background into it and just kind of paint that. If this is wrong and this is wrong, it'll still work in some way because they're just working together as a team to make the painting that they're making. It doesn't have to be exact to what's going on up there, because honestly you guys don't have a clue what's really going on up there. So I'm putting that red in, and now that introduces that feeling of that in there. I just sort of cleaning it up a little bit. Maybe there's a little more shadow at the top. I wanted to push it in like I was talking about too, making the shadow slightly larger than you need so that when you paint into it, you can control that edge. If I just paint it right to where it needs to be, and then I try to control that softness through the with the next tile of light or whatever you want to call it, it will actually make it the wrong shape. So it's hard because I like to see the drawing, and if you paint the shape bigger, you're kind of missing some of the drawing. But painting's hard anyway. None of this is easy. It gets easier the more you practice, that's it. But like anything, it takes a lot of practice. I don't really have a lot of shadow here, but I know there's a miniature little sliver of a shadow, so I'm just going to put that in so I can paint into that too. Just having that nice little bit of that warm tone, casting a little bit of a shadow under the hair. That little ridge of hair. Upper lip, there's a little space of light I don't need in here, so let's just fill that in. Maybe a little bit of casting shadow around, like I know there's probably something in here, so let's just go up to that edge. And also I know there's some stuff, if I squint especially, there's some stuff happening here where this hair is casting a shadow, but it's also sort of they're like little shadows of hairs, so it's a very soft, almost like half-tone like value. When I'm talking about value, just purely dark or light. This hair could have probably gone up, but maybe I'll do that with a color of some sort. I see this down here is a little distracting. Things like that I like, but my eye keeps looking at it, so let's get rid of it. Maybe later I can come back and bring in a little bit of the little transparencies or streaky moments of the hair. I will go back because I talked about the darkest stuff sort of setting up on the surface as the solvent escapes the painting and goes into the air. And now I think I can actually draw into these places that were a little bit more wet to start. So just a little bit of that kind of separation between beard and hair on the head, I think. And then maybe in here a little darker too, to just start pushing that down and back. And then I wanted to bring this bit of his hair forward, so I see a little bit of dark here, and that helps. I like that it's through here. There's a little bit of, maybe that's too much, maybe a few streaks of hair, because what feels like to me is that like I have all this drawn and this shape, but over here it sort of disappears into the hair, so it feels like a little bit imbalanced. Like this side's heavier, but it's really having to do with just like dark or light of certain things. So I want to just address that because it's all about, it's a feeling that's happening. It's not like it's maybe more right than it is wrong, but it feels wrong. So if it feels wrong, it's wrong. It's like if you have a straight line you've made with a ruler and it looks crooked, then it's crooked. Doesn't matter what the ruler says. It depends on how it makes people feel. And that's making me feel weird. A couple little accents in the brow maybe while I'm here, just darkening, get that like little moment where the eyebrow's kind of like a wedge, so the top's lit and the bottom's a little darker, and that just gives me a little bit of movement and form. There was a little darker accent. I could put in the darkest accent for his eyes now, and maybe I will, just to kind of have that in there. Just a little moment of darkest dark. This eye too. But those shapes are kind of dark enough. Maybe we'll make the shirt here disappear in the shadow a little bit. I went really straight at first. I don't know what I was thinking, but I'm now just gonna kind of curve it. I like this hair dropping down here too, which is a risky move right now, an unnecessary one. So let's do it. Let's see what happens. I'd like to make some mistakes and figure out if I can fix them. I just want this kind of flow and movement coming down because he's looking that way. If I put too much going this way, I'm kind of pulling us away from the general feel, I think, of his mood and his direction, which way he's looking, I think is really important. So I guess that's stuff when I was talking about there's not a lot of composition to talk about. While there might not be, you know, these are little things that I'm thinking about and addressing. Because now it is sort of how can we make a head sit in the space, but, you know, somehow be the most interesting it can be. Because a lot of this does really change the composition. And that's what I had an issue with that too. And I think I'll have enough time anyway to like kind of put some, maybe the red stripes would be nice because they're actually very similar to the background color and it might just be a really cool moment. It's a real dark accent right here, which is great on the shirt. Maybe we can just, since the hair and the shirt are blending, let's just make it look like they're not blending by putting a shadow there. Maybe like a little bit of this line. But also the hair gets darker here because I'm thinking of the hair like a sculptural mass, and that's sort of what I'm doing. So now this too, it's starting, like, I like these big brush strokes, but are they now relative to the big picture? Are they like distracting? Or, I mean, everyone's gonna have sort of a different opinion about that. We all like different things, so. In the end, it's my painting, so I get to make the decision. I might make the wrong one, and I apologize ahead of time if I ruined it for you. No refunds. Okay, so I think checking back, good to go. I like where I'm at. I like the likeness. I might need some dark in the mouth area, but I don't think I need too much. Okay, spoke too soon. That's better, actually. Okay, so now let's do the same thing I did with the shadows, and we'll do it with the lights. Because this painting is majority light, or the subject's majority light in the light, I spend a lot more time on the lights, and that's why the shadows have gone somewhat quickly, because there's not a lot of shadows to paint, so there's not going to be a lot of focus by me put on them. I think it's good to prioritize one or the other. If I have a painting that's mostly, if I'm sitting in a position where it's mostly in shadow, I'll put more lights, more values probably, a little more color movement, and then let the light side be a little more flat and simplified. I don't usually put equal amounts of values, or priority, I guess you could even call it. So let's mix the light side. I left this whole side for it. What I'm going to do is, like I did with the shadows, mix a big average. If one color on this palette works with white quickly, it's burnt sienna or scarlet, a transparent oxide orange or whatever they call it. So I'm grabbing a chunk of that. I put out too much burnt sienna today, as you might notice. But I do think it's important to put a lot of paint out. You can see how I mix too. So white and burnt sienna is already starting to be close. And this is that thing I was talking about where I was taught to put in like the green and the red and some blues and all this stuff. And it always ended up at the same color no matter what I put in, because you can kind of just balance them out. But I think in this case, what I started to try and do was just say, how many people can we use burnt sienna, white, and just this? Because this is in the value, it's closer in value than just the pure untinted blue. And it's just cool enough, I think, to like give us that range with the burnt sienna being an orange and the blue being blue. They can meet at a very gray skin. So if you want a grayer skin tone, you can go pretty cool. If you had maybe somebody who has really pale light skin, you use more white, you use more blue. If you have darker skin, less white, maybe less blue, maybe more blue, maybe something else. But if you can start with these two colors, a lot of times I notice like you get with the tinted manganese blue and the transparent oxide orange, you can get pretty close. And what I'm doing is I'm not allowing myself to stare at him for too long. I don't want to make him uncomfortable. But the real reason is that I do want to make him uncomfortable. No, I think it's important to not let your eyes focus, because when you walk into a dark room, you can't see anything because it's a dark room. Eventually, your eyes can see. Our eyes have the ability to fool us too much. So like when I'm staring at his shadows on his neck earlier, if I let myself focus on that for long enough, I'm going to see more and more light because my eyes are going to open up to the lack of light and let in more light so I can see the information because of how sensitive our eyes can be. So what I want to do is instead of actually looking at the shadow while I'm trying to find the value, I will paint, or I'll be looking at his lights and feel that shadow and its relationship to the whole. Same thing with the lights. If I start staring at him to try and find what color he is, his skin and light and average, like I'll see too many things, I'll see too many darks, maybe I'll start to see too many halftones. If I just move my eyes up and down, I get a feel for like this like kind of abstracted version of John Paul right now. This is like his face melted onto my canvas. I don't need to see the parts, the likeness, I need to see the colors and the value. And so I can see how this looks up against that red, and I look up and I feel like, okay, that works. Or I look at the shadows and I look at their relationship. It's lighter than the shadows, great. To me, that color's fine. It works out today. If it wasn't, I would ask myself why and then figure it out. Is it too green? Start putting in reds. Is it too cool? Get back to your, maybe that's the same as too green, but maybe that burnt sienna is the way. Maybe this cad green, maybe we want a little more green. And I can show you, I can put all those colors in, it's not going to make a difference as long as I end up back at this. So it's not really how you get there, but it is quicker to do it with 2 pigments rather than 7. So I just put a little thing up here in his forehead, which to me is just a safe place to put some color, and that seems fine, good enough. And the beauty of like kind of mixing the large piles is that even if it's a little off, I have unity, so it all comes from this pile. The idea here is it's not the highlights, it's not the halftones, which I consider the dark lights, and it's not like the warmest or the coolest parts. It's an average that I can darken, lighten, warm, and cool, all from one average. So still not looking at highlights. I don't care about highlights yet. Highlights are great, but they're not really anything worth getting too excited about. Because without just sort of proper foundation of the rest of the shadows and the average tones, highlights are useless. Highlights to me are the like cherry on the sundae, and you cannot put a really fancy Italian cherry on crappy ice cream and make a good sundae. It's not going to happen. Same thing with pizza. Really great cheese on terrible dough is not a good pizza. So we're not to the cheese yet. We're not sprinkling nuts on our sundae yet. So let's darken this. So to darken it now, there's a lot of ways. This palette, because halftones to me kind of gray as they darken, often I mix a gray. Cobalt blue and burnt sienna together, dark orange and dark blue, they make gray. They make a really great gray, especially when you put white in it. You can kind of see the range you have. You have that range to go more blue and more orange, and it's I just think a great combination. And what I do is I just mix a little pile of it down here that's going to darken this thing. I mix enough to make sure I'm not going to run out and I can cover all my halftones. You can see how many towels I go through. I prefer Vivas or shop towels, but today I'm using Brawny. Okay, so just keep looking at some of the stuff I'm going to address. So what I want to do now, I have the light placeholder, I have my dark shadows, I have no edge work. Here I started to just because I've been scratching at it so much. That's the kind of stuff I want to address right now, is just the forms that turn. Here we're casting shadow. I might have a tone in between, not super important. To me it's more like between shadow and light, how can I knock that corner off and start to turn into these lighter values? The nose, it's a cylinder that rolls around. The tip of the nose is a ball or a sphere. The whole head's is some sort of egg that's darkening on this side, so it's those middles. Through the brow, we're rolling into the light, so we can kind of address that with these dark lights. So it's dark lights. This is the stuff that turns it from like that flat graphic to now really pulling it out of the shadows. So if I just mix these two together, then I start to have a dark version of this. I can look at that and decide whether the temperature now is what I want or not. I used to mix more blue into this and realized that my halftones were going too cold. And it was sort of like stressed to me that like as you transition light to dark, it goes sort of warm, then cool, then warm, then cool, and warm and cool. So let's just say you have a warm shadow, like these kinds of orangey shadows. The next tone up should be cool, then we get into a warm light, then maybe a cool highlight. I think I took that too literally and spent too much time like really making my halftones too cold for many years. And I've started to realize, like, especially with something like this where we have a lot of red and a warm background, my halftones can be warmer relative to my thoughts, but they could be cool relative to the painting. So that said, we'll figure it out by just putting it down and seeing what happens. There's a great, like, we used to go see this painting at the Norton Simon, a Rubens painting, and it was maybe David and Goliath, and there was just the knee. The instructor would always talk about the Rubens knee, and it was like the warm kind of orangey shadow, and then the halftone was kind of gray and cold, and then it went to this pink light, which was the average light, then his highlight was a little bit cool. It was just warm and cool and warm and cool, and it was, it's pretty great. It revealed a lot to me. So I'm going kind of safe right now. It's a safe value jump. It's almost like too close to shadows, but I also down here have this like kind of loss of kind of clarity in whether it's shadow or light. So this is a perfect place for me to test out these colors to see if I like them, and they'll work because there are little miniature shadows. I might need to go lighter, so then I go lighter. And before like just putting down a bunch of stuff wrong, I'm just going to get it right and then stick to it, and then I'll sort of judge other things. So that's fine. It's a darker tone than this, which is still my target, sort of. Temperature shifts. I think the colors look pleasing. So now I'll maybe go over here. I'm just kind of staying away from the light source, and I'm working my way towards it. Another thing I didn't mention, and I've started to realize, is when every brushstroke anyone does, or I do, or any decision that I make, there's three things only, I think, to think about. First thing is the drawing, the shape of it, the placement of it. That's it, simple, drawing, most important thing. Second is the value, the darkness or lightness. Is it too light, is it too dark? Or does it need to be lighter or darker? And then the third thing is warmer or cooler. It's sort of based on like fixing your mistakes. First is the drawing okay, second is your value right, and third is your temperature need to be warmer or cooler. That's it. Really simple. There's only three things to think about when you're painting. It could be all three things in every brush stroke all over your whole painting, but still there's only three things to think about. So here I'm trying to connect that feeling of that darker shadows and hair and stuff mixing. While I'm mixing my colors, I'm looking at the model, and I have a plan in my mind for the brush stroke I'm going to do. It could be a few marks, it could be one long mark, it could be a very short, quick mark. But I'm thinking about it, where I'm going, and when I'm going there, I'm not going to change my mind when I get up to the surface. So right now I want to do this cheek, so I looked at it, I looked at the temperature, relative to the other stuff I had. I can even check it over here, because that's where it needs to go. The idea in keeping these separate is that like you want that separation on your painting. That's starting to turn, and it's a safe turn. Again, it's probably darker than maybe it needs to go, but I'd rather it turn safely than to jump into the light and ruin my shadows. I think I just want, because this light is, it's harsh, but it's also got some softness in its modeling of the forms. I'll just be a little bit careful and spend a little more time making those turns. Maybe a few more values in between. So here, let's open up that light space a little bit, because there is more of it. Then there's that little, there's a light down here, and that's where that's the part I'm a little bit unsure. Like, I don't really feel like it needs it. Like, it wouldn't change his likeness if I put it in or don't put it in, but one thing is I always, even that, like, is maybe enough. No matter what we're designing stuff, but, and we're editing, it's all a bunch of editing, it's all a bunch of kind of interpreting, because none of this is really real, it's all an illusion. Like I said, it wasn't magic, but I guess in some way it's magic because it's just an illusion. But like, if it's working without it, then maybe I don't need it. But I'll try it because I think it's important to, like, we're studying life. And then we're trying to make it better. I do think most often, like, life gives us the most beautiful color and shape. You know, we don't need to, like, our nature, you know, can handle it. We're not going to make it better. So maybe we just have to try and, like, do the best we can with sort of interpreting it. So in here we have, like, that dark light. Great, let's just put that in. Start to really push that back, because it's actually going darker than that tone was, which is going to now make it like that part of the face. And I'm just looking at all those tones, working my way towards the light. Still not looking at highlights because I don't care. I love those fancy cherries though, I really do. Okay, so now I'm right around his brow where we have a lot of strong halftones. So I mix the color. It's in here that I want to kind of figure that soft turn out. It's almost like hard to tell where the shadow and the light transition. I do try and just define it if I can, but every once in a while you can't. So you just kind of maybe paint slightly lighter shadows in the area and slightly darker lights, and then it just gets addressed. But all this great halftoning in here, I need to really, like, kind of address. It's just a very subtle roll out of that shadow. And actually that changed the shape, so I will have to go back maybe, and which is great because with this organization, I have the brush for it, I have the palette all set up, I know where I mixed that stuff from, and I can go back to it very easily. And that's it. That's the whole point of, like, having an organized palette, is it keeps the painting organized, keeps the process organized. This stuff, you know, those little fixes become very simple. I guess maybe not very simple. They become more simple than they would have if you were to mix 50 little piles and hope that it was staying organized for you. Okay, so in there, against there, I've got the warm, so I'm going with that stuff where I've got this little bit of red in there, but I do see more cold gray tones, so before I cover everything, I'll do that. I'll just kind of put in some of the reds first as a base, warmer tones around the eyes. We do tend to have, like, a warm band through our center of our face. If you divide the face into thirds, it'd be cools, warms, and then some people say yellows, which I think is sort of just like this primary thing. You get the cools, especially on a male, you will have cools because of the beard growth, but on females it's just a more cold temperature there. Also, I think part of it has to do with the contrast to the warmer tones through the middle section, and so our cheeks, our nose, ears tend to be warm. I noticed as I was working on this red stuff around the eye that in his mouth, that kind of shadow lip coming in had a little bit of a similar temperature, so while I was there, I just tried to address it. So I think now, like, I'm going with this darker light here, which means I think I need to go with slightly darker shadow here because it just feels like I'm not getting the turn. But I like that darker color on the lips, so then we'll just make sure to kind of darken some of this stuff so that it doesn't, so we still have the lip in light, the side of the face in shadow. And I see one other thing, like his mouth looks, I think this corner is making him look like he's doing something with his mouth that I just didn't quite paint that corner in. So let's just, because it's going to be a dark accent, I'm just going for it with the dark and just sort of start to push that shadow in there and the crease and under the mustache and everything. Now I see the other side. I can use it in here too. And I do think maybe his mustache will have to darken through here in the shadows. And instead of making it pure black, I'll just use very dark, but not all the way black maybe. And let's just make sure like there's hair in shadow over here. Even this stuff, it can just sort of maybe start to blend. Still no questions, huh? Or are there?
Yeah, we've got a couple come in. I'm just letting you talk. Do you want to ask them some?
Yeah.
Cool.
Why not?
Okay, one was actually talking about halftones from a guy called Todd Kowalski, who was saying at the next step at the halftone area, what's the best way to think about dark and or wide the first transition is? Or is there a way to think about the form turn that might help us?
I would say dark or light. It should group with the lights because it is light. It's dark light, and that's the one thing I think. Like I'm making it kind of darker too because of the, like I was talking about wanting to slowly creep out of it. But if you go too dark, it's a shadow then. So it is that weird little balance. What I do is I look at the palette, and when I have my light, I just make sure here that it's a dark version of this, but it's not like so dark that it's this. It's just like, so sometimes I'll take it and I'll mix it, and that's what I do is I check it right here. I put one little piece right there, and I can see that that jumps. So that's a good way to sort of maybe just test it on the palette. You know, you can always change it, move it, adjust it, whatever. I kind of like brushed out in there, weird, but I'll fix that. And then as far as width goes, it really varies. Like on the nose, it's real thin strips. On the cheeks, it's wider. Through the middle of his brow, there's like a slower turn. So it all varies on the part you're painting, but definitely, like, if there's doubt about its value, closer to the lights, because it is theoretically a light. Like if I were to go up there and cast a shadow from that light, you'd see it go through that area and it would stop right where the shadows go. So it is a dark light. Okay. That was from Todd. I'll see Todd next week in Scottsdale.
We've got another couple from Paul Barker.
Okay.
I'll go for this one. When painting from the model, how do you balance between what you know about the anatomy and what you see or observe from the model?
I think, and I've heard this before too, like people like, I forget who it was, Scott Burdick or somebody in a video once said like, knowing anatomy is only good, you know, when you need it to get you out of trouble. And so I do kind of believe that. Like, I don't think like you need to know anything about anatomy if you're really good at like copying and translating into like kind of flat shapes, because that's all I'm doing is I'm you know, I might know some anatomy, but I'm really trying to think like about other stuff. Not other stuff, but not anatomy so much, and sort of just creating this illusion of 3 dimension in 2 dimensions. So I think anatomy is great, but and important, but I don't think it's like that important. And I think Sargent even had said that at some point. Don't learn to paint portraits. Don't learn to paint this. Just learn to paint like from observation or something. That was a really generalized version of the quote. Don't paint stuff, just paint. But that's it, yeah. If you can kind of learn to just abstract everything in life, then it doesn't really matter if you know anatomy. But that's the thing. There's a couple times, like if I'm too far away from the model, or I'm maybe too, I don't know, my eyes are getting bad too. Maybe that's part of it. Like I know I can make up some stuff, but I don't think it's that important. And for me, painting from life isn't like what I do for finished work. It's what I do for teaching, and it's what I think is important to do for really just practice. To me, it's like going to the gym or something, you know. Not that I ever go to the gym. It would be like going to the gym. It's like doing push-ups in some way, practicing, so that when you get home and you work on something more serious from photos or whatever. I mean, you can always paint from life to be serious too, but the majority of what I'm doing painting from life is purely just exercising, so trying things and all that. Okay. So I'm still just kind of adjusting drawing, going through some of these tones. The bridge of his nose, I know, here's where it is. I know anatomy that this is a turn. There's maybe a slightly sharp turn, but in my mind I know there's a turn. It's a cylinder. So I am going to put some some sort of halftone across the nose. And I know I see more red in the nose, so I'm going through that red area. It's a quicker turn, so maybe I won't, so I'll grab more white or more of the light. And let's just see if that works. Or I'll just paint that really thin. So back to like Todd's question about how thin. Here it's sort of a little bit of both, like thin and maybe slightly darker just to make sure that turns. But then I don't want to change the shape of the shadow that I already drew, because I feel like the shadow I drew looks like the nose. So I'm careful with those halftones and that tiling of the next shape, because it can end up looking like you change the shape. You know, if you start making the nose look too round because you have too many tones, then now there's no point in the halftones. But I know that's a cylinder, so I want to kind of step from the shadow to the medium, to the light, to the lighter, and I have that highlight sitting there. And then the tip of the nose is kind of like a ball, but again here, like I see it more defined, so let's just keep it more defined, or at least I'll take that light and push into it. And then down at the bottom, maybe it turns like right here. That's fine, and then maybe this will just kind of soften here a little bit. I mean, that's okay. To me, that's like kind of, that's one of those moments where I feel like I'm losing the nose just a touch, but like, because I talked about it so much right now, I'll be okay. We'll remember. I see more red here, so let's just put like the red there. This little halftone, the nasolabial fold, not super important right now, because this is a highlight right there, and I think if I do a dark line first and then I do a highlight, it's not going to be what I want. So be careful of folds on the face, creases, aging things. Like a lot of times things like that don't translate to paint as much as they will. I mean, we see it in reality and it's like, that's fine, but really, what is it? How does it look in paint? And oftentimes I just feel like it ages people too much. Of course, you gotta like age them appropriately. You don't want some elderly model to look like a spry young thing, but still I think there's certain things we need to think about when painting, like kind of editing them out. There's a lot of space for editing and removing stuff. And on the other hand, I would say never should you like make up stuff that you don't see, at least for this, because again, this is study. One of the things that I think is the reason I say that too is like that kind of idea of, and I come across this a lot in teaching, is people putting highlights in the eyes. You know, they want this really great highlight in the eyes. It's that twinkle, it's the thing that's, you know, the most important thing to live for, but to me it's not. And it's but a lot of times I see people having been taught to put highlights in the eyes when they're not there, and that to me is like, nature's telling us the answer right now. Like, if there's no highlight in his eye, I'm saying that even though I have highlights in the eyes, but when there aren't highlights in the eyes, I do think like don't put them in, because they're not, the light can't get there. So if you want to be truthful and paint it right, then don't put highlights in the eyes. But when you see them, put them in. So that's the, you know, don't make stuff up, but edit a lot. I went a little lighter there because I saw it, because I'm trying to now test slightly lighter temperatures or values, and I'm going here a little cooler because I like the kind of feeling of these cools around here next to the, or on top of some of this stuff I already painted, the warmer tones. So I'm just going to start putting in those and testing like the cools. So on this area now I have the dark version of my lights, but I have a cooler and warmer area too. I can use the same brush. I've got the paper towel to kind of clean it in between. It's very helpful. But I just want to kind of like get this area covered. And you notice I didn't draw the dark line all the way through that area yet. I feel like I may or may not, but I do think like if I want that to look like a ball, putting a dark line across the whole thing might sort of give me the chance to not give it like roundness or movement or something like that. So I'm always trying to think of movement and gradations and rounding forms. And so like in the center, if I don't put the dark line, it might give it a more of a rounded feel. Or maybe I'll go back and do it slightly, maybe a little bit, like not pure black, but maybe just something in between. There I noticed a little more dark, so I went down here and I grabbed, in my halftone area, I grabbed my shadow or my darker mix, and I just started to make it a little darker here to bring that shape out slightly. There's a lot of little things going on around the eye area, so I'll be a little more careful. And everything I'm putting down is mixed on the palette. It's not, I don't spend time like really mixing on the canvas too much. Not that I don't ever, but I would say this, for painting from life, this is pretty much how I do it every time. I don't like blending so much for these. Okay, so just kind of addressing all the tones around the shadows so I can just sort of move into the next shape. His eyebrow is like coming, it's sort of a slow blend into the skin too, so maybe I'll use halftone temperatures and colors and values for that. So a little bit cooler maybe, and we can just kind of transition that really transparent dark stuff. The top of it even looks more cool as it's in light, so maybe I'll just grab more cobalt blue. A little bit of the mix. And that goes back to like when I was talking about like mixing certain things, like grabbing the closest, easiest version of a color. If I wanted to mix that like colder stuff, I went to the colder area, I went to the value, and I just added a little bit of blue. A lot less work than trying to just do it all over again. So if I find something dark on the face or something even in the shirt, let's say the shirt has that red that's like the background or similar enough, then I'll just go to the background red and adjust it till it's right, because that's the fastest way for me to get there. Okay, well that's starting to maybe get too light. I'll leave that for now. This side's more dark, but there's still a top ridge that's lighter. So let's just put in a little ridge. Maybe here I don't want it, I want it soft, so I'll just kind of put that in there too. And then I start to see, okay, so now I know I'm using hair tone cools. So what else do I have to do with that? This halftone's a big one right here, this subtle, really subtle face. I mean, if he shaved, I don't know how much would even be in shadow. You might not even get any shadow till right here, but it's, now there's like these micro shadows from hair, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. So, value should be in this dark light range. I'm gonna go a little darker, maybe a little bit cool again, because now I know I have to connect it to like that hair. The other thing is there's texture of hair. So maybe, even though I'm not using solvent right now for any of the other stuff, maybe I will use just a touch of solvent so that it kind of, in here, it's a little more textural. Yeah, I think that's too dark, so I'll go lighter and see what we can get. I still want, I'll creep out of the darkness because I have to go from dark to medium to light to lightest. It's just this gradation that's coming up. So, like that in there seems okay. I think I got it from right here. So instead of just start smearing it around, I'm gonna go back to where it was and just make sure that's the one I want. And let's just see if we can kind of like paint a little bit into these tones and just start to connect what's gonna be here to what is already down here. Using textural sort of brush, let the brush kind of dance around a little more. And I do see now I want to bring the hair up. So to do that, I can do with whatever brush, but since I'm using this brush already, I'll just do it with this one, and I'll do it right here. On the palette, I'll go to the darker part. It's much easier for me now because I use this for that part to just look at it on the palette here instead of going back over here to address the darker shadow version of it. I'll just go here, and I'm using the solvent. I know when I use solvent, it warms it up a lot, so I'm gonna kind of put the blues in there to counter that effect and let me actually do that. So here, we can leave some of that stuff we have. We can kind of paint into what we did there and just start to get more of this tone transition and just texture there. That's what I want. Maybe here too, let's just make it a little bit more textural. And that, to me, like, my instinct is to fix that brush stroke to make it more flowing, but at the same time, I like that little directness of it. So I'll leave it for now. That happens a lot where I'll do something like a brush stroke that I like, and then I'm just like, I can feel myself like kind of fighting it, and then I watch my brush just completely get rid of it. So we gotta fight that sometimes, you know? Like, there's a lot of like kind of stepping back and just letting it be. And that's something when I was in school that I really worked on, because the guy I learned this palette from, Michael Husser, he was always doing really great kind of designed shapes, and his brush strokes were very thoughtful, and I really liked that, and I wanted to get there. And so when I was in school, I was really like, every time I'd make a brush stroke, I'd stop and I'd leave it, and it became like habit to paint that way, and it was really helpful in sort of learning to be very direct and decisive about my marks. But now I'm, you know, less strict, and I allow a little more of just allow myself to fix things, or, you know, not create all those rules I had talked about, like so far. So now I know I'm getting towards the point where like almost every shadow shape I have painted has been addressed, and now it's just like, I can almost fill this in and put highlights and be done, but I'm not going to. So I'm going to just sort of make sure to go back down here, because now I do have to connect that same kind of hair down here to just, like I was just doing. So let's start putting in those layers of tones that I just did, the cooler. And then it jumps to light pretty quick, so I'll just sort of address that little turn. And let's make this start to change shape too. In here there's a lot more kind of half toning. And then because his beard's casting a lot of shadow, I kind of used all my halftone. I think no matter what you do, every part you mix, you should make sure you mix enough. To me, that's the biggest thing. Once you start having to remix, you start losing that sort of the unity, the ease of kind of like working with this type of layout too. So that's because it's a light shadow and I went with a dark light, I didn't get any change in value, which is okay. I actually don't mind that, because I can maybe get I see a little bit of shadow coming, or light coming into the shadow. So I added a little cad green and red because I felt like that was the color that was happening in here, something. So I can just start to kind of maybe put that in as that darker light, and then I'll bring in a brighter light in here too. His hair, this side, the hair there's a soft edge, so let's just kind of go along that and just sort of make it look more like it'll be a soft edge. Of course you could brush it out, but I never brush things out. It's not really the way I paint. Not right or wrong. None of this is right or wrong. Maybe it's more wrong than right, actually, but it's just the way I do it. It's what I've learned. Hopefully you can take something from it and it'll make you better. Okay, so now next step of light. I still feel like in here is weird, but I can actually grab more. I am going to grab one other brush and see, because I really like a number 4 for size. Between 4 and 5 and 6, they're not that different at this scale, but enough for me. I think out of habit, I'm so used to these number 4s that I'm going to use a number 4 because now I'm really going to start to, it's time to get serious now. Here we go. Just, I like the 4, more accurate. And that one was starting to feel like it was getting less accurate. Minimum 1 brush for the background and the tone, 1 brush for darkest darks, 1 brush for shadows, and 1 brush for lights in my book. That would be the the most amount of brushes I want to clean and the least amount of brushes I want to paint with. Okay, so next step now is really just like connecting more. How much more light can I get in there? So I start grabbing more light. It's really simple. This is it. I've committed to this value and this color. And now all I have to do is put a little more at a time. At some point soon I will actually mix white into it and do highlights, but for now I just want to see how this works. Change the color if you need. Like I do see a section, and I'm putting this where I should have gone up here because I had all my warms there originally, but since I've kind of obliterated those, it's okay. I still have general sections that are going to keep me kind of tuned in. So that to me, I see like this warm in there because it's cheek, it's red from there. So I put a little red, I took a little more light, a little more average, and then put a little red. And that's how, at this point, is just what I'm doing. Like, what color is it? Where is it? What value? And then what's kind of the theory on it? And it makes it a lot easier. And then I look around like, so this is the side, this is an egg, right? His head's an egg, it goes dark, medium, light, then lighter. I'm on the light, or the lighter, or something. I'm not on the lightest yet. But same thing here, like there's a little bit of a feeling of like, it's a slight bit of a sphere in there, you know? So let's turn that too. It might not turn all the way to highlight, and it might not turn all the way to shadow, but it's still got the dark, the medium, the light within its little realm. I do see some warm around the eyes, and I want to like play that up a little bit because to me that's, again, that life that we're trying to capture. There will be things on the face I find pure, bright red, but there's never anything I find in this kind of lighting that's going to be purely cold. Mouth area still, so again, I'm working here, but I'm working here, and I'll kind of work my way up. The forehead I haven't really even touched. I should have probably done something here. It's hard to tell if that's dark light or it's light shadow. I did put in a little bit of shadow just along the edge. I could maybe do a little more shadow. Let me see. This was the wrong brush, but it was close enough. And let's just try a lighter shadow. It doesn't make sense that there's kind of a green quality when there's like all that red up there, but I think it'll help. So again, if it's like I can't tell, it doesn't matter. Get the value right, whether you give it a definition or not. And that's something in general, I think. Like, I get a lot of questions about like, well, is that a warm color or is that a cool color? And to me, that's starts to just get too confusing because everything's so relative. So you take a perfect middle gray and you put it next to red, it looks green. You put it next to green, it looks more red. You put it on top of black, it looks light, and you put it on top of white and it looks dark. So giving a specific color a definition is sort of a waste of time when you can't compare its relativity to something else. So there, it doesn't matter. Is it dark, is it light? It's something in between this and this. So just make sure I paint something in between that and that. So that was a shadow, a light shadow. Maybe I can now just try these halftones and start to really step across. So see that? I like to show the paint a little bit in kind of like tiles. I think it's more interesting for me personally to look at. I don't think it's not right or wrong, it's just a taste thing. I blend more in my studio work, but I like showing the paint. I think it's nice to see paint. If I wanted it to look like a photo, I want it to look, I mean, you know, people say, oh, that looks like a photo or whatever. That's meant to be a compliment. I know a lot of artists don't take it that way, but they're just trying to say it looks real, and that's a compliment. But I also want it to look, I understand because photos are flat. I don't want it to look like a photo. I want it to look like it's real life. I want it to look like it's breathing and maybe gonna, you know, talk to you or something. All right, that's perfect because I'm about done with those half-tone stuff. I do have a little ways to go, but it's like setting it up. It's pretty good so far.
There's no worries if you were
Okay, any questions right now? Or? Yeah, let's answer some
I'm gonna
questions.
go sit in the sun. How long do we got here?
Yeah, go
2
sit in the
minutes?
sun. Yeah, you take
5,
take
10,
5.
Okay.
Yeah, I might
maybe
even
5.
use
Feel
the
a little
restroom.
chilly.
I could get you a heater too.
Oh, that's it.
Gotta keep it cold. You gotta want it.
Okay. So we got another one from Paul Barker who was saying, do you have a perspective on more narrative, figurative and portrait painting versus, do you have a perspective on more narrative, figurative and portrait painting versus figurative and portrait painting work? That is more direct and painting like what you're doing now, like Sargent or Soroya. Sometimes it feels like narrative painting appears forced or contrived versus trying to capture the moment or beauty or likeness in the model in direct painting.
Yeah, I never put narrative into my studies from life. I mean, they show up. Part of it is either the day, the class comes into play, you know, the interaction with the model or just how I'm feeling. But to me, it's purely like kind of clinical study. Of course, all the little brushstrokes and everything that my own story kind of show up in there somehow, no matter what. When I'm working from photos or whatever, I do put a lot more thought into it. I use a lot of photography but also most of my career has not been spent like dealing with too much narrative. A lot of it's just painting people I know, painting friends, and sort of trying to document my own sort of journey. So I don't know. I mean, I can see where, yeah, I think no matter what, whether you're doing it from in the studio or doing it from life, I think trying too much to put a narrative into it can feel forced no matter what. And I don't know if that answers the question clearly enough, but I'm kind of a weird about narrative myself because I just feel like, who am I? Like, who cares about what I think? Why do you want to hear my story? Here's how I paint and that's it.
Cool, okay. I'm just going to say to Vanessa, she wrote in asking about halftones right after we had just touched on halftones. So
Okay.
For Vanessa, if you wanted to just go back about 5 minutes from when you joined,
Yep.
you'll see us talking about halftones. From Sarah Brown, I believe she's watching from the UK, Sarah. She says, I really like subtle use of highlights. Could you please explain the hierarchy of highlights in portraiture? Which ones lean to the highest values and how sharp or soft these can be to describe structure under the skin?
I will definitely get there when I get to the highlights. I do think there is a hierarchy of them. I do find them to, you know, they are that little icing on the cake or the little accent, and that's the other thought. Like, you don't put 50 little cherries on your sundae because that's over the top. You get 1 or 2 choice ones. I think that, like, if there's a twinkle in the eye, we're going to go for that for sure, because I think that's not only is that going to be the brightest, most contrast usually, because it's sitting on dark, it's also like what people think of the windows to the soul, and that's kind of becomes important. The other highlights I find, like, I just kind of gradate as I go up. I'm thinking about the light being at the top, so more highlighting towards the top. Forehead, maybe a broad highlight. Noses tend to be more oily and probably have a pretty good sharp highlight chance there. And then from there, everything's, I would say, kind of less important. But as I paint the highlights, I'll go into them specifically because I'll be searching for them and trying to figure out like which and why at the time. But honestly, I haven't even looked at his highlights yet because that's just how I work.
We got a question from Craig Scott, who's watching from Utah. He said, are there some differences between painting from photos versus from life? Is important information, i.e. value, temperature, lost or altered in photos? Does your approach differ in any important way when painting from photos?
Yes, there are differences, but I also feel like there are less differences than most people make us think about. I did train to be an illustrator, so we used whatever we could. When I was in school, there was no digital cameras even. I had a pager, and we had to take pictures with disposable cameras. So like I learned to paint with anything and make it up, but I also painted from life a lot, so I learned those tricks. I do think that I think cameras nowadays take plenty good pictures for working from. I know we can't see all those subtleties, but I'm also trying to like flatten out a lot of things and keep things simple. So I spend time. I like a decent camera. I use a little bit of Photoshop, but I try to make something look like it would from life to my eye. And then, but even through when I start painting it, there's a lot of things being interpreted differently. So I think photos are great. I'm so not somebody that thinks they're bad to paint from. I think I mostly do that in my studio work. I only do it in my studio work. I don't even have a setup to paint models from life at my studio here, but we're doing it because for you guys. But yeah, I think like they're kind of, I mean, I'm doing a big painting for my solo show this year, and I've only been using iPhone pictures, and I'm going to piece it together. But it just gives me a lot more freedom to like paint everything I want to paint while having the shapes and the design there very quickly. So sometimes, yeah, a lot of photos, good photos, sometimes bad photos, but I don't think one's better or worse than the other. And as far as approach goes, when I'm working from photos, I will use, I'll spend the time in Photoshop, I'll make it look as good as I can, I'll piece things together, and then when I go to paint, I spend more time drawing those things out because they're more complicated. I'll draw them in graphite, and then maybe do a few washes in acrylic to just sort of seal the drawing, and then after that it's just a painting. And I do the same thing, I'll mix up dark to light and just sort of apply the tiles over a much tighter drawing. And then at some point I might soften it, but generally wet into wet because that's how I learned.
Okay, we just had another one come in from someone's watching from the Netherlands. I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to pronounce her name.
Okay.
But it says, great demo. Maybe Sean can tell something about his larger paintings, like studio work, for instance, front door. How does he organise or approach this painting? So
just like I was talking about, that one front door is actually not very big. It's probably about this tall and maybe that long, and the front door is right over there with all the locks on it. I did photography. I wasn't trying to think too much about anything. I had a solo show and had to crank out painting, so I was just taking a lot of photos. On that one in particular, I remember dividing it right down the middle because that's a rule you're not supposed to do in a composition. So I thought, well, I'll divide it right down the middle just to see how that goes, and it worked out pretty well. But yeah, that one, the head and all of that was pretty much painted wet into wet, but with a tighter drawing. But the portrait on that is only that big, so it's really tightly drawn and then painted almost probably about similar approach, but probably in a lot less time because it's tiny.
Cool. That's it for now.
All right, can I have one quick break real quick? Yeah. I'll be back in a different costume. Oh yeah, do I need to take this off? Okay. Okay. All right, we're back.
Live on the internet.
Live on the internet. Okay, so again, like always, after break, check the last stages. It's all that dark light I'm addressing. I like a little bit right now. I see this crease a little stronger, and so maybe I know also there's highlights there and there, so I don't have to go too dark right here, but I do like that shape, so let's just see if we can preserve that. Okay, so at this point too, I think I might start, I'm gonna mix now, lighten this mix. So I've started to use some of the average, but now I also like to just have the whole range sort of established. So I'm mixing up some light here. Anytime you add white, add at least one other thing. That was something I learned, and I find it helpful. I mean, again, it's a rule you can try and break, which is fine. I encourage that. But one thing I'd say is if I just add white, more than likely guaranteed that it's going to look kind of chalky relative to the last colors. So I'll put in white, and then I'll add maybe red, green, anything to kind of just give it some temperature again. I can start looking to see what, you know, maybe it'll go colder. I know white already goes kind of cool, so I'm a little careful not to go so unnaturally cold, but eventually I'll get there. Somebody had the question about the highlights, so this is where we're gonna maybe start thinking about that with temperature and sort of planning. The light's coming from above, so no matter what, the forehead should be the brightest. Theoretically, light falls off as it goes down. Look at any of the greats, the Sargents and the Rembrandts and all those guys. Even like Van Dyck's really great for like that kind of lighter forehead, and it just kind of, the light diminishes as it goes down. And I can see that now that I'm starting to look. The chin has light, but this section's lighter, and then overall this section's lightest probably. I have a lot of highlights in here, but that's again due to kind of like oils and different types of skin and stuff. So my goal is to sort of concentrate the lights to here and less down here. So I have that color. I don't know if it's going to be good, but it's there. I'm going to go back down and just address some of this stuff with this average now. Check the temperature, decide if it's going to work. In here, this might be just fine, so let's just test it. That's starting to be what I want. Maybe I drew it too big, so I'll go now and try and load this brush up with the halftone that was there and just kind of push that up slightly. If you imagine the teeth in here, there's a sphere there, so it's the bottom of the teeth or the muzzle or whatever, and I felt like I pulled the light down so much it wasn't turning under like I really want it to. Okay, now the chin is also, it's a little sphere in here, so I have, if we could see it, we have shadow and we have light, but I know this is that last bit of light, that part where the light's hitting. And I'm not going to the highlight because we are prioritizing and creating that hierarchy of light. So in that moment down there, it's the lightest light, and it's fine. That works for me. I like the way it sits among all those other tiles of value and temperature. In here, you know, there's a lot of like light, shadow, little things. I don't want to sit there and render. I mean, a lot of the mustache is covering. What I'm going to end up doing probably is going back to the shadows and just sort of like shaping up some things to really clean up that area. I'll go down to the neck real quick too, because that's just like, it's like the background is kind of there to support the head, but not really that. To me, not that crucial, not today. So let's just get this light in here, and that's the same as the chin about in value. It's a little kind of warmish, but not super warm. In there, maybe I'll go a little bit darker. Again, I used up all that mix of the halftone. It wouldn't be a bad idea to grab some more of it, or mix some more of it, but I also know that like I'm kind of past that stage where I really need to worry about it too much. I'm going to be doing more lights, so maybe I won't deal with it. Here we get like a colder kind of light as that plane starts to face the light more directly. I think of the neck here as like a cylinder that's facing down, so the light's hitting it and kind of raking it. But then as we get down here, it turns back up to the light a little bit, and it looks colder. So I'm going to go over here, and I had mixed the original part of the neck from here. Just go right next to it, a little colder, a little lighter, but not too much, because I don't want to make this part too important down here. This is not this stuff. It's up here that we're dealing with. So that's fine. Neck to me is sort of out of the way. I mean, maybe this could be lighter. But like I said, it's out of the way, so let's just stick to that for now. We'll go back to it if we need. Okay. So making sure, again, that we're turning the form. We have this, and then everything just kind of starts to travel up. Let's go. This color still looks okay in here. So what I wanted to do is test. I have a dark, a medium, a light, a lighter. I don't know if that many tones is really important. I don't think it is, but at the same time, like, I don't hate it. So you can kind of take and decide how many tones you think is important. And I think, you know, minimum one half tone is fine usually. If you had like your average shadows and then you go one of those dark lights. I went for 2, and now I'm doing the lighter light. But just like I said before, you know, it's my painting, I get to decide. So cleaning up that shadow a little bit, because that's a casting shadow, it's a hard edge. I'm okay with that. I like that hard edge there. That's the one thing to me, like edge-wise, like I'm much more into sort of like edges within the form, the soft halftone or the soft form turning shadow versus harder edged casting shadows. Like that's really, to me, all I'm really concerned with edges in this kind of painting. I went for that light tone just because it's there. I'm just sort of connecting it. Up around his eye here, I don't see a ton of crazy color shift, so let's just kind of fill in a bigger area. And now that little tone showing through there is actually so close in value to what I was going for that it's working out. Often that doesn't work, but thank God we got it on video. So that's where like a nice simple tone can really make your job easier. Like the way this is not like jumping and looking crazy, it actually to me will probably end up looking nice to leave some of those spots because of that contrasting slightly colder feel to the some of the warmer skin tones. So there you can see stepping dark, medium, light. That's it. To me, I don't think it's important. Like a lot of times I see people looking for like bumps. They're like dark and medium and light and then dark again and then light and then dark and then like it starts looking like this forehead's doing that. Essentially it's an egg or a cylinder or a sphere. It's darker there, it's lightest here, it gets darker that way a little bit and it gets darker that way a little bit more. And that's it. No need for extra bumps. Not in sort of that general first part that I'm kind of addressing. Of course, when we get into the highlights, yes. Okay, so now on the nose, I want to warm it up a little bit so it's in that lighter range, but let's just put some red. Scarlet Lake is great. It's also darkening it just a touch, so maybe I need to go to kind of the lighter, adding some white. I don't want to veer too far from the average though, because once I do that, then I'm gonna risk kind of loss of unity and stuff. But I want a little bit of warmth here. I want to feel that like warmth. And with the red background, we can kind of get away with a lot of warmth today. And I'm not going to go too crazy though. I'm trying to be actually more as correct as I can be so that there's some graspable information. Okay, that seems okay. I do kind of almost see that whole front plane as just like a simple value across, and then right where the highlight hits and down the ridge, it almost will like be the same on the other side. So here I can kind of leave that little tone as a placeholder just so I can see it. But I'm also just being very careful not to lose this shape, because it's this shape that I originally drew that's giving me the likeness, or what I was intending on being the likeness from the start. So just be careful all along those edges to make sure I'm not losing that drawing. in some way, this is a very like illustrative way to paint, because in illustration work, there's a lot of like drawing everything out. You know, it's not like super painterly approaches to things and looseness. It's design and photos and everything's really figured out before the paint goes down. So that's why I like to draw a lot, and that's sort of where that I think that comes from for me, is all that extra drawing or slow kind of approach in the beginning makes this stuff kind of work a little better in sort of its patchwork and painting by numbers. And a lot of people like paint by numbers is kind of a bad thing, but I like those things. Hairlines should be slightly soft, I think. You know, of course, if it's like overlapping, that's okay. You can get a hard line, but where it grows, where you see growth, I think a softer edge looks more natural. When you go with a really hard edge, you start to look like it's like a kind of that wig effect. So when you're painting that wig, use those hard edges. Which in when I teach, there's plenty of wigs actually happening. I see some cold there, so I just went back down. That was what I was thinking and what I was doing. I put a little bit of blue in it and just went for that kind of halftone, because I see how the hair and the skin here just kind of like merge into this kind of soft, cold moment where it's really like the highlighting on the hair. And then as I come down here, I see it again in here, this kind of bluish stuff. And I just know as I'm mixing into it, it's going to turn that bluish, relative bluish color. Another thought is like, I was just looking at that color and then I looked at his shirt and it's kind of similar, this kind of gray thing. If the color of the shirt is very important or saturated or maybe even too like really light, I'll address that stuff super early because I think it's going to affect how the painting looks. In this case, I don't find it to be that important because it is gray. And so it's not bouncing a lot of color, it's not jumping out color into my eyes, it's just sort of sitting there being a good boy and being gray. Okay, so now I'm still working towards these areas, but let's just address this. I see this halftone here, so I see a real division of side of the face. So let's go back down to what we're doing. It's colder stuff, cooler temperatures. When I open my eyes, I see a lot more value there. When I look over my glasses, I see it kind of simplified. So I love that I can actually do that with my glasses. If any of you have decent vision, but not great vision, that's something I do that's really helpful. Is just I look over the glasses. I can look down through my glasses, and then when I look up, I see the model or any subject, whether it's a still life, landscape, or whatever, in a different light or a different amount of detail, and I can kind of make my decisions much more quickly without being distracted by my vision. I do think it's important to not see too clearly. Okay, so here, now I go very kind of methodically dark to light often in demos because of the, I'm trying to make a whole bunch of points, but I also think that like, it's a general dark to light that's most important, and then I would say kind of jump around. Like I have to jump around, I think, a little bit, and I'm going to start now. Just kind of jumping into different, maybe hitting some of the highlights, because now I really need to start thinking about that. So I'm putting that in as a tone. It looks dark, but again, I know I'm going to have some of the brightest lights right there, so we don't really need to do anything with that. I don't need a ton of information or separation here, because I have it down here. And now what? So maybe I'll do this because this is also that kind of side turning down from the light stuff before I get to those highlights. I'm just working up to those highlights. Okay, so now starting to connect these averages. And there's been times where like if I'm rushed or something, I like his ear showing, but I'm not going to paint that. It's actually good because it's showing me this stuff.
My hair behind my ear?
Yeah, but it's all right. It's not really screwing up anything other than the fact that I don't have an ear there, but I am the creator. I would say, like, I don't think it's a bad idea to try and put that ear in if that was, like, it's like plein air painting. You're chasing the sun. We're chasing the ear. Okay, so now I'm going to go lighter because I really have to start like exploring those light moments and getting this thing to be finished. I have no idea what time it is, by the way.
It's just gone 12:15.
Okay, well that'll be perfect. So you can see I talk a lot and I paint slow, but I really paint in a way that's kind of deliberate, so I think it does work a lot quicker if you take your time on the palette, take your time with your mixes, take your time with everything. There's always this like frantic rush when there's a blank canvas to make a mess and put things down, and I think like oftentimes that when you're learning, that can get in the way. I think at some point when you learned a lot, you can do anything. But I've found even for myself, like this little bit of organization goes a long way in sort of how successful the painting will come out. So I'm trying to find that light tone that's not halftones, but it's brighter than the last. It's sort of in between, like in here and stuff, and I think that's close to it. What I want anyway. Here, and again, thinking of everything as just kind of some sort of cylinder, sphere, some ridge, some box with corners, mostly not with corners in this case, but there's a great like Sargent painting, a couple where he does this crease on the brow, and he uses, I noticed he used a very cold, like a very warm kind of and wide brush stroke to just kind of put that crease. And he's done, I think, in one of his self-portraits, and then I forget one of the other major ones he's done. But I think it's very revealing on how maybe you can do creases in the face and make them work. So I think like what I've observed, not so thin lines, not too black or cold, because it's probably some little fold that's like got, like this one in particular, it's a fold that's facing down. But if we were to zoom in really close, that little bit of light hitting below it would reflect a warm temperature into that shadow. So a little warmer than you think, probably a little lighter, and then again, not thin lines. Thin lines look a little harsh and strange. It's like once you make it a thin line, you're asking for more detail, and once you're asking for more detail, you're telling us the painting needs more detail. And I think like, so, yeah, you can use little lines, but maybe if you're going to use little lines, then you probably have to paint all the hairs and all the eyelashes too. So just keep that in mind. And I don't like doing any of those things, so I prefer the illusion of things as opposed to kind of force-feeding everything to the viewer. And I think that's just my own personal thing too when I'm in a museum. I can appreciate really tight paintings, and I actually used to paint really kind of tight stuff, but I think like the more I get to be involved as a viewer of a painting, like I get to like looking at a beautiful Sargent where he's like made, you know, a fan, somebody's fan or something, like in 2 brush strokes, like that to me I'll stare at so much longer than the guy who painted the pattern on the fan and painted everything else, because I get to be involved as a viewer, and I think that's something to think about when you're painting too. Again, it's like, that's my taste, not necessarily everybody else's. Probably a lot less people prefer the painterly stuff, maybe. Okay, so I'm getting to that point where I really have to address highlights, and I know that's the big question. So we're just going to start lightening a little. Let's play with this light and see where it's at. I noticed the highlights, there's a lot of great little colors. I find with highlights that you have to put so much white in them. There is so much white in them that I think also adding, kind of pushing the color a little bit beyond what feels natural or right helps the painting kind of be more interesting. So I'm just gonna, I saw some warmer tone in here, so I went for the white with the warmer tone. I could probably exaggerate that red a little bit because next to the nose it has a little bit more of that. And sometimes, you know, our eyes kind of play tricks on us too a little bit. So like, I'll look down and see something, and then I'll look up and it's not there. But I do know a lot of times like that kind of, I screwed up that shape. The redness around the nose kind of does sort of bleed down into that lit area below. So I kind of just trim that off in the corner. So let's, again, like I had the brush for it, I had the paint mixed, super easy to fix things. Let's go with this. I forgot about the mustache, how that is going to bridge into that light too. So I know there's like these really kind of cool little moments slipped in there where the hair and the highlight of the skin start to cross over. We're probably, if we're zooming in really close, seeing both skin and hair overlapping. So let's just kind of create that softness with the cold transition temperature. And then let's just kind of come in here and paint up to that a little bit. Okay, so that's starting to feel okay. Maybe I'll start exploring just the highlighting around the nose and stuff because there's so much going on up there. So a couple things to think about. I was talking about warm, cool, all this stuff, and layering and values. I think that like the most important thing you can remember is just move your temperatures. It doesn't matter if you go warm and cool and warm and cool. As long as it's not all warm or all cool or it's all dead color, you should be okay. I used to really like get like wrapped up in the idea of the cool halftones, and it just like became too much. And I started to think about that and like how like through a warm band, you still have like cool and warm as you're going through there, but you still have like the warm band. I'd seen a great self-portrait by Velázquez in Rome where he had super red lips on that painting. But the shadow was more red, the halftone was more red, and the highlight itself was super pink. So he had warm and cool reds, but they were still local color red. So that to me was kind of like, okay, that makes a lot of sense too. Like when I'm doing a lip or something, or this whole nose area, I have warms and cools, but generally relative to the whole thing, it's all warmer. Hopefully that's not too confusing because now I just really threw you. Okay, so over here, we're getting lighter, but I don't feel the warmth in the cheeks so much. I feel kind of a, nothing too crazy, not too bright. Maybe that's even too bright, so let's back it off. Don't just put a bunch down if it's not right. Let me just go a little bit darker. And again, the beauty of the palette is I have the option now to kind of have the colors. I can kind of go back and simplify. And I think that even there, I want a softer feeling. I know I'm going to have a highlight in here too, but I just want this to be a little more soft first. Because like I was talking about, like that highlighting and stuff isn't going to, highlights are not going to make this thing, they could break it, but they won't make it. So a little warm in there, and I just want to kind of clean up that area before I get to the highlight. Again, red in the cheek area through here. The highlight's there, but this is a little bit darker. Another thing too, I've been talking about is just painting application, your brush strokes, direction. I was always taught kind of, and I think the general kind of thing that everyone believes is across the form. Across the form gives you maybe the most form, but also I don't always think that's the best way to apply something. I like this little halftone that's happening here, and I think I'll leave that and kind of work into it because I think it's a little bit of that interesting, those types of things to me are like character. So across the form, down the form, whatever. I like down the form on the edges because I get to kind of like make a nice long swooping shape and maybe design something cool. But then in the center I go across the form. So to me that's like the balance. If you're gonna not want to pick one or the other. I've seen people talk about just kind of always across the form. So that means on this edge you're just going that way across, and then center across. And that makes sense. I don't subscribe to that style. I really do like kind of, like I noticed Sargent, again, I'll just keep talking about Sargent, how he would do a lot of that across, like down the form on the edges, these long, beautiful swooping lines, and that's super interesting to me and just pretty looking. So to balance it, I go down on the edges and across in the center, and then you get kind of the best of both sort of worlds in that case. Okay, so back to just kind of closing off all the forms before highlight. I like to kind of paint usually close every shape, sort of contain it without leaving that ground showing through too much, and just make sure it works that way. Because if it works that way, then we're good to go. Then we can put the highlights on and they will do their job of just kind of being a accent. So close that. Let's go over here and do the same. A little lighter because I want that form to turn, so wherever I am with on my values. And we got a lot of interesting little lights in there, so I think it'd be just easier to apply those if I had some of the, like an average tone down. So trying to figure out what that average is with all those highlights is tricky, but I'll just sort of go for something safe. Okay, so there's a little bit here, which I don't mind. And I don't want to, maybe some of those holes are okay because they are really what makes the painting also look definitely like a painting. Okay, so one more little thing right here. There's some, maybe that's a little too hard edged or something. Okay, so now let's look at some real highlights. The forehead's got a nice broad, colder highlight, and I haven't used much purple, let's use a little bit of that violet. I used it in the background, but it's just, to me, like, you could go cool with this, and that might look nice, maybe a little blue-green. But I do find, like, when I'm going for a cold highlight, sometimes too much of this, like, manganese blue is, like, completely foreign to the skin tones because it's, like, on the color wheel, probably one of the furthest temperatures. So I find, like, if you make it more purple sometimes, like, it actually maybe complements the warmth of the skin because it's the cool that has a little bit of an amount of red in it. So let's just go with a big highlight here to start kind of figuring out what we're doing. I'm not going super bright, not yet. I don't find it important to go too bright, especially there. I'll go a little lighter. Another thing, like Sergeant Notes or somebody, maybe it was his teacher Duran, would say like the highlights should be one step brighter than the grand average or something. So I always think about that because it is true, if you go too bright, it starts to look weird. So what I did there is I had a purple first and it started to feel like it was kind of cold. So when I went lighter, I added yellow ochre. When I added yellow ochre, now I have warm and cool in our highlights. And then here I looked at that part of his highlight on his brow and it looked a little warmer. So I put a little bit of red in there. Now I've got like a purple and a yellow and a red highlight. Very subtle shifts in temperature, but enough to, like, in the live, say, viewing of this painting, to look at that and say, okay, well, it's not like a colorless highlight, whatever it is, there's a bunch of colors. But I do think sometimes because there's so much white that makes things cold, more color is helpful. And then also, because highlights do that job of that little twinkle, I think another reason to maybe like sneak colors in and make them, make these little highlights twinkle a little bit. So like the warm and cool kind of playing off of each other, I think is somewhat important in that case. Sometimes like these little moments where I didn't paint the light and it's just the ground and it looks cool, I could put a little warm highlight next to that and it might actually look pretty great. It'll look like I have a cool highlight and a warm highlight when really all I have is a hole to the ground or the ground showing through and then a warmer highlight. So I'm over here just trying to like make sure these values are turning enough for what I want. I like the intensity in the eyebrow area, the brow. One thing I didn't talk about at all was likeness. And likeness to me is sort of, if anything, if you can just get it correct, get the shapes correct. Like if we took a photo, traced the shapes, and you know, looked at them that way, they'd be correct. You'd have a likeness because they were traced. If you can get used to translating those shapes from those kind of 3 dimensions, the 2 dimensions, and flatten them, and you can get that exactly right, then you should have a likeness. That's the hard part. But if you, then you can kind of think about just sort of drawing generic heads versus like caricature. I think, you know, when you're studying, there's a lot of learning about sort of standard heads and proportions and things, and but then you see something like an extreme caricature, which nowadays we see lots of political caricatures and things like that, and where like you could have a mouth up here and an ear, you know, under the chin probably, and someone does it well, and it looks like you have a likeness. So I do think in that sense, like if you have perfect likeness and you had extreme caricature and then you had extremely generic man, always leaning towards caricature will give you the likeness. Once you're leaning the other way towards like this generic ideal, you've lost that sort of thing about that person that's specific and what makes them unique. So just remember, with caricatures, you can see a likeness. A generic man has no likeness, like those planes of the heads or any kind of those like things for studying. I think it's good even to practice doing caricatures to see what that's all about. That said, I don't do that. But I think it'd be good if you're looking for some homework in the internet world. So I see, like, I'm messing with those highlights, but there's little tones. I don't love to get too complicated in here, but I will add one more subtle tone to round out the feeling of the ball a little bit more before I put that highlight on. And that highlight is pretty bright. It's probably one of the brighter. What color is it? So I got to take into consideration the color of the bulb. We have a pretty daylight bulb, so in that way I don't really get to like choose. If I had a warm light then or a very cold light or something, I'd make sure I really pushed it. But in this case, I think because I don't, it's sort of balanced, we can get away with both, you know, a lot. So I think a little warm, a little cool, 2 highlights, maybe a darker one and a lighter one. There's a little light one made of more pink. Maybe I'd go a little colder and just darken it next to it, and then maybe on here I can put it in at the top or something. Just like little colors next to each other, warms, cools, with sort of the general feeling of the temperature addressed. And if I feel a color, I'm gonna maybe try and exaggerate it. Like in here, we have to go bright because there's a lot of light. But what is that? That's kind of a safe. I did okay there. I'm okay with that somewhat, but I think I want more color. So let's try now red and white. That's Scarlet Lake. The Scarlet Lake and the white are really, in my mind, great friends. They get along very well. I went to go see a Sargent show in New York. Maybe some of you had seen it a few years back, of like friends and whatever people. And I noticed in person something that you don't see a lot is that his highest highlights tended to look like what happens when I mix Scarlet Lake and white. They almost look more pink in person than I would have maybe originally thought based on just seeing some of those in books. And so it kind of validated the feeling I get when I look at some of those highlights. They feel like this pinkness. But I also look for the coldness, and I think it's important. Maybe that green's a nice one with white. That green and red together, you can kind of, they both meet at yellow, the Scarlet Lake and the Cad Green, so you can kind of get away with a lot of those kind of neutralizing each other, and they're pretty great together. I see this really bright little light right here. I'm concerned that that's going to be weird, but I'm going to put it in anyway right now, and then decide if I need to get rid of it or if I can somehow keep it. Okay, so that's still okay. I haven't addressed the white part of his eye, which I don't love to paint anyway. I don't think it's important. A lot of times I see that people painting the whites of the eyes to be actually like white. That's probably shouldn't call them the whites of the eyes, because then people really paint white. I'm putting a little cold in here just to kind of give me a little more temperature movement. But I think that a lot of times the white in the eyes is really just similar to the values of the rest of the skin in light or shadow. So if they're in shadow, put them in shadow, like they're dark. We just want, like we want highlights in eyes, I think we also want the white to be like that kind of cartoon light thing. And they're not. They're sitting in shadow, they're inside his head, shoved away, not doing anything, not coming out into the light. Okay, so I have like this great little like subtle light here, but I want to be careful, like this ridge of highlighting that comes through there, that's pretty great, but I just want to be careful not to go too bright, because I need it to, I still need to go brighter in those moments where it's brightest. I think this highlight I started to put in, I could move it down slightly. I think I'll go maybe more exaggerated violet on that. And exaggerated in highlights is kind of not even that exaggerated because of the amount of white that's in there. The white becomes kind of the dominant color. But let's see, like that's probably too purple, but at the same time, like maybe it's interesting. Let me now balance it out by putting some warms in the same area on the highlights, and I can just kind of like give those something to kind of support. That feels okay. A little red in here might be nice, pinks. I don't want only dead colors around the eyes, because then I might risk looking like kind of dull, so a little back into those reds a little bit. Okay. How are we on time right now?
It's just going up to 22:01.
Okay. And we're just maybe about close. How you doing, John Paul?
Oh, good.
We can do like a maybe break for the last 5 and do some questions,
Yeah.
because I think I'll be done just in time for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that part feels more or less resolved to me. I mean, there's always more that can be done, but the real trick is learning when to walk away, which I think is one of those things you never learn, and so having a timer is good. Now that he's kind of leaning back just a bit, I like actually that the highlight goes right to the edge, and it sort of goes with this highlighting I did when I wiped it out on the hair. Gives me that kind of ridge through the whole head that gives me some roundness underneath all this detail. So let's go to those whites of the eyes. They're just gray to me right now. They're kind of like dark, and there's a little highlight. So what I'll do is I'll go to shadow because they're inside the head. We'll go to the gray it a little bit, but they're surrounded by warm also, so I don't want to go too cold. I have a little bright highlight there that's actually just sort of taking away from what this feels looks like to me. So I'm just gonna put it in there, kind of make it soft and dark. The other side is maybe a touch lighter, a little bit warmer. I can see a lot of times if the light's coming in on this side, this eye will get a little more light because of just the way the light kind of can get in there and falls into the exposed eyeball. So we can just put a little bit in there, and that feels nice. And then just look for anything that's distracting, because we are kind of getting towards the end. I don't like to have people paint with a timer so much, or at least be scared of the timer. But I think it's important also to maybe sometimes set up timers for yourself and practice, do exercises with time limits, because you have to kind of figure out your time management. Unless you're painting in an atelier type of situation where you have 50 hours, then you really need to learn how to like walk away. Because I think that's the one thing that you can really start to overwork stuff easily when you have too much. And I've also just noticed through teaching that, like, I used to teach 5-hour classes and I used to teach 3-hour classes, and I'd have the same people in the same classes and they'd paint the same amount no matter what. Whether they had a 5-hour time limit or a 3-hour time limit, they'd get to the same point. So it's sort of how you practice, I think, that you will end up sort of painting that way. So I wanted to knock that corner off now that we're trying to refine some stuff. There's a lot more, like that lip to me is a little flat right here. I like this, that's that battle. I like that brush stroke, I like that it's simple, but is it doing anything for the painting negatively or positively? In this case, I think it's somewhat negative. And then I just looked up and saw something that's gonna maybe help me. Instead of darkening more shadow around there, I saw a little bit of like light on his lips, so I think that might be a nice moment to just put in a little bit more of a reddish color, pink in the light, and we'll sneak it in over here, like that bottom ridge of the lip that comes out. That seems okay, but I still think I could darken or soften some of that shadow edge. Another thing I'd say too is like certain, I don't know what I was going to say. Oh, just like hard or soft edges in like eyes, nose, mouth, things like that. Noses don't move, so I think hard edges are fine. I think a little bit of an open mouth is awesome for like creating that life, because it almost feels like the model's about to say something. Maybe he is. I don't know. Hello. Are we done yet?
My eyes are blurry.
Where am I? But any of those things like might be nice for this story. The other thought with that too is eyes. I've seen a lot of paintings, and a lot of what I'm teaching is based on what I've seen in museums, what I've learned from other people. That kind of era of painting where they were starting to really render forms softly, but then I don't know, maybe 16th century, 17th century, but like really sharp eyes. I don't think those are good. I mean, I just think that like what happens is they have all this great soft rendering, subtlety, and then you get to the eyes where there's all these hard lines and it looks dead. And I think what I've noticed, if you look at an eye really close, the edges of it, of the iris against the white, are just the sclera or whatever. I don't like to talk too much anatomy, but they become soft. If you look up close, they are soft. So I think maybe the intention in the old days was to like pull the viewer into the eyes, but then like to me the reality gets lost in the eyes. So I think a little bit of softness in the eyes creates a little bit more movement. When the model's sitting still, their eyes are blinking, their nose isn't twitching around, it's not moving. It's the only thing I think is just that the eyes have a little bit of movement, and I think slightly softer seems to work better. So now try and make hard-edged eyes, because I want you to break all the rules. So I'm putting in a little bit of alizarin now with my black. I took that mix and just leaned a little more heavy on the alizarin, and I'm trying to accent my darkest moments. The alizarin, remember, in the eyes and stuff will give us that little bit of what's underneath. A lot of life. Nostrils, a dark accent, also more like alizarin. I need to clean up this shape a little bit. I'm not going to do the other nostril. If I blur my eyes enough, or even if I open them because I can't see that well, it's not there. So don't paint it. If it's not there, don't paint it. If you don't see it, don't paint it. I see a little bit like of a crease, so I'm going to do that just feeling of the crease. I'm not going to draw it out completely. I will just go into these kind of details and like accent that so it feels like, yeah, that one kind of looks a little, that one made him look sleepy for some reason, so that's a little better. There is more darkness here. Just make sure here I have the darkness I need. We can maybe add a little bit more dark here to push this, now that it's like really covered, or it's I mean really set up the paint a little bit. And then let's just push this in darker, more green and blue, because those are the ones that are kind of more black. And I actually like this just as a bigger shape right here. Just saying this hair's coming out, there's shadow, it's just sort of giving us more layers, I'd say. So that's where now I'll just kind of follow that, and this shape to me looked the same as that shape, so let's just kind of change it. Good enough. Now how are we on time?
It's 1:45.
Oh, the time doesn't move when you ask. Every time. Okay, I got time. Okay, I'm gonna just put in, I see a couple things here. I was doing that fold, but actually now it looks more like the necklace thing, which I wasn't actually gonna paint.
Did I move?
The who?
Did I move?
No. I was gonna just put in, I wasn't gonna put your necklace because it didn't make it, but then I just drew the string by accident. I don't know. I don't think it needs a necklace down. It's too low to maybe like make it like, it would be distracting. So what I want to do now, let's just play with the shirt a little bit. I don't love to do really detailed stuff in the shirt. I didn't even, like I'm not getting the highlight in the eye that I thought. Let me do one little highlight on the lid because I have time. The highlight on the lid that I'm getting down here is just a little kind of reflection of moisture on the top plane of his lower lid. One thing about like sharp little specular highlights that I think is handy and I like to do and I was taught to do is mix the paint, mix it kind of thick, and then push it into a little pile, and maybe with the brush, I'll shape the brush to a point by twisting it, and then I'll push into that little bit of paint and pick up a little flick. That one you can see, I don't know if it picks it up on the camera, but that tiny little thing of paint. It's like when you're making whipped cream and you're checking for stiff peaks. That's a stiff peak. That can be kind of deposited in the most sharp little accent of a highlight without the brush ever touching. And not only will you get like a nice little thick light that actually picks up a light in the room so it looks brighter, you can get really sharp. You can actually allow a little more color and stuff in there because it is a thick piece of paint. So it's not that bright, this mix I did right here, but it still sits there as a little light. That looks cool to me, I like that, okay. Hard to tell until you take it out of here and into maybe another area. So this to me is a little bit hard edged, right? Just right here. So let's just take whatever I had, my brush, and just kind of knock that down slightly, and back to the shirt. So what was I gonna do? What is that shirt? It's gray. I kind of started to set it up. I have the red. Let's use the same red. It'll just key it to the painting. If I want it to move faster, I might need a touch of solvent because we are now getting down to the last few minutes. So let's just put in a red here, just a little accent. Be painterly, you know, maybe like not all of it following the form. But I do think that's a nice little moment now. Maybe it could use a touch more white so it's just a little dull. At this stage, sometimes I start making a little bit more of a mess of my palette because I'm just kind of like grabbing colors to finish up the last few things. Okay, that's fine. And I could do things like lighten here if I want separation, but I don't feel like that's going to help him look better. Okay, so what other colors in the shirt? I see a little miniature blue stripe, very small, but it might be a nice moment. And if not, darn it. There's no time now to change that. This is where you should learn to walk away. It's happening.
Your inner self is telling you.
Yeah, no, every time. Yourself always tells you, you just have to listen. Okay, so maybe that's my walk away. I do it on that side. But no, I can't. One here. See? It's happening live. Okay, so the gray part of the shirt now, I don't care about like folds. I don't have enough to deal with folds, but I want to put a little color. The closest color on my palette is that blue pile. Let's just see how blue or say cobalt, even and burnt sienna neutralize and make gray. When you add white, they're very pretty. When I look at it, it's too green, so what do I need? I need maybe a little bit of alizarin because that will counter the green, and again, having that much red in the background might make sense. I'll put a little solvent because I want it to move. I want like kind of painterly sort of application at this stage, so let's just sort of put in a couple accents. I think this shoulder maybe is important. Or maybe not, maybe that was a mistake. But this is where a lot of my, like, how the paintings end is just doing too much on the shirt. But people tend to like these things, so I'll just keep it here for eternity. Like, that's fine, maybe, it's just color. I think, like, this shoulder, with this shoulder, the whole time it's been an issue whether I should define it and move it. Maybe just soften it a little bit, that's okay. Now how's the time?
No, it's just gone 10 to.
Okay.
We can get some close-ups if you want.
Oh yeah, let's do close-ups. Let me do a few accents real quick, just like things that I think.
Take your time on the things you want to finish it out. You know?
I would have walked away. But I think, like, we got this great little button right here. It's actually on the red, but I'll put it next to the red. And then over here we have, maybe we can just sort of pretend there's a button that's not highlighted. I feel like these little accents do kind of, maybe if I was a little more careful too, they'd be a little more important, but they do work. They're nice moments. Okay, so I'm going to put on this one just a bright kind of flick of a highlight. Yeah, but there's more. Okay, actually though, this is where I would like say, let's call it, because that to me is enough. I'll just round this out a little bit. And I'll say that's done. Let's put our initials. That's when you really know it's done. Then I have to walk away. All right, it's the end of the painting. So thank you all for joining.
We have
some questions.
We have a question, yeah, and then
okay.
we'll do some close-ups
Answer
as
some
well.
questions, and then we'll give you guys some close-ups so you can see more of these textures and things happening.
So we had a question basically asking what colours do you use for, like, blonde hair and red hair?
Blonde hair and red hair, I should have brought in a painting of one of those. The great thing about that palette is that, like, with those three colors, you see this wash, the first wash, that's like blonde hair. That was it, to me. You add the darks, and those are your lights, and then you probably need a little bit of highlighting with white and something, but blonde hair tends to have a lot of green quality undertones, and so, like, this stuff works great. You get all the movement of hair and texture, and you can get all the colors. For red hair, you can put the Indian yellow, which I did not use at all today, but Indian yellow has that really warm undertone with a little bit of alizarin, and you can get the orangest kind of translucent hair qualities with those. So red hair, orange hair. Pretty much the only thing I wouldn't use it for is like white hair, gray hair, which I would still have a warm base to, and then I would just put the cooler grays on top. But I always think there's a little bit of a need for this undertone of warmth, as if it's like remnants of what the hair used to be, and it's sort of bridged to the warm skin tone. We got another question?
Yeah, I think so. I think we just have one come in. There was a bit more to that question as well, which basically she was asking, how do you then, she said, I was hoping you could suggest what darks to begin with and then how you would modify them for midtones and what you would use for a few highlights.
For hair.
I think she was for hair.
So for hair, I mean, honestly, all those washes I did, when you start to really look at blonde hair, watch out for that camera, then you're dealing with, like, the greens, like I said. And if you look at blonde hair, the dark parts are really dark. Did you need me to pause for a second?
Yeah. We're back on.
Okay, so olive green in the darks, the olive and the alizarin really make nice undertones for the dark hair, and then I use a lot of transparency to kind of create that middle tone, and then in the lights, I would say probably yellow ochre, white, any of those kind of cool whites and yellows. And then I think a lot of the mid-tone of blonde hair, I've noticed just through painting blonde hair, I tend to use the shadow mixes, not the light mixes. All right, next question.
Okay, this one is from Todd
Hi, Todd.
Kowalski. He said he had one more question. This is painted under a daylight bulb, right?
Yes.
If it was a cooler light, what would be a few general thoughts as to how the colors would change? That painting of Sean's is awesome.
Thanks, Todd. Honestly, to me, this is as cool as I maybe go from life. I do use gels sometimes, but the thought is the same. I'll mix. That's where this mixing averages. They're based on the color of the light and the skin and everything. So let's say I want to do like a fake moonlight painting or something. My averages would just be cooler overall, and I'd add the blues then. And then you have that thing you kind of get warm and cool out of. But it usually just starts with that average mixture, and you just need more blue. It's really not too crazy. But yeah, this is about, I would say daylight's about as cold as I'd go from life anyway. All right.
Final thing is Sarah Brown just said, thanks, that was an amazing live stream. Going to study more Sargent. Really
Awesome.
Brilliantly filmed again.
Cool, well,
Cheers.
thank you. Enjoy Sargent.
I'm going to try and move this in.
Okay, we'll get you
close.
some,
We might lose your audio for a sec.
that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna get some close-ups for you, so I'll move out of the way. Are you doing
The
it?
audio is going to go out for just a moment.
Okay.
So stay tuned with us. We're just going to move one of the cameras so you can have some close-up shots.
is on.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Hope you enjoyed that demonstration. You guys can find me on Instagram at Sean Cheetham. Maybe consider taking a workshop to try this from life. Hope you enjoyed and watch it as many times as you can. Take some notes. See you somewhere soon.